The story unfolds in the borderlands of Castle, a place that had been struck by an unrelenting drought. The land, once fertile and thriving, had been reduced to a barren wasteland. The wells, which had long been a source of life for the people, had run dry, and the once lush fields had cracked beneath the scorching heat of the merciless sun. With no water to sustain them and no crops to harvest, fear took root in the hearts of the villagers. Desperation weighed heavily on them, and one by one, families began to make the painful decision to leave their homes in search of a better fate elsewhere. However, their attempts to flee were seen as a great betrayal by the Margrave of Castle, who ruled over the land with an iron fist. To him, abandoning the village in such dire times was nothing less than treason, and treason, in his eyes, deserved only one punishment: death. In response to the villagers' actions, the Margrave dispatched his soldiers to hunt down those who attempted to escape. That day, terror filled the air as soldiers stormed through the village, mercilessly attacking anyone who dared to run. Screams echoed through the streets as the innocent were cut down, their hopes of freedom crushed beneath the weight of cold steel. Among the many who tried to escape was a young boy. He ran as fast as his small legs could carry him, his breath coming in ragged gasps as a soldier closed in behind him. But before he could get far, his foot caught on a jagged stone, and he tumbled to the ground. Pain shot through his limbs, but it was nothing compared to the sheer horror that gripped him as he looked up to see the soldier standing over him, sword raised high. He screamed, calling for help, though deep down he feared no one would come. Overseeing this madness was none other than the Margrave's son, a man both feared and revered for his power. A sorcerer of great might, he often boasted that the blood of divine kings coursed through his veins, setting him apart from mere mortals. With a look of absolute displeasure, he observed the chaos unfolding before him. His expression twisted into one of disdain as he watched the villagers scramble like frightened animals. With a slow shake of his head, he spoke, his voice laced with contempt. Even the lowest of beasts, he said, understood the value of another's kindness. Yet these people, these parasites, were incapable of gratitude. Did they not realize that they were still alive only by the mercy of his lordship? By the grace of those who carried divine blood? And yet, at the first sign of hardship, they abandoned their homes without hesitation. Had they completely lost their fear? As he spoke, a desperate voice broke through the carnage. A woman, her face streaked with tears, fell to her knees and begged for mercy. Her hands trembled as she pleaded for the life of her child, asking only that the boy be spared, but her cries fell on deaf ears. Without hesitation, a soldier drove his spear into her body. A gasp escaped her lips as the cold steel pierced her flesh, her eyes widening in shock. The force of the blow sent her collapsing onto the ground, blood pooling around her lifeless form. The boy, still on the ground, could do nothing but stare in horror, his mother's body lying motionless before him. The Margrave's son watched this unfold with a deepening frown, unimpressed by the spectacle. How could someone be so foolish? This was becoming dreadfully dull. One of the soldiers, sensing his master's growing boredom, quickly stepped forward, bowing his head apologetically. He begged for forgiveness, admitting his ignorance. What could they do to entertain him? Not long after, several people were rounded up and hung from the gnarled branches of an ancient tree. Their hands were bound, their bodies dangling as they struggled against the noose tightening around their throats. Women clung to them desperately, supporting their weight to delay their inevitable suffocation. The Margrave's son observed this scene with mild amusement. Parents supporting their children, wives holding up their husbands. It was almost poetic. A soldier called for his attention, and he turned, a smile playing at the edges of his lips. The soldier, wearing a cruel grin, pressed his foot onto the head of a wounded man lying in the dirt. The man groaned in pain, too weak to fight back. With a mocking tone, the soldier asked what they should do with him. Should they hang him by the waist instead? That way, he wouldn't die too quickly. He would have time to struggle, to suffer. After all, should he not be given the same chance as the others? A girl, standing nearby, sobbed uncontrollably. She begged them to stop, pleaded for mercy. But her cries only irritated the soldier. With a sharp slap, he struck her across the face, ordering her to step away. She stumbled, clutching her cheek in pain. Ignoring her, the soldiers strung up the wounded man. The girl, tears streaming down her face, called out his name, Ivan. The Margrave's son chuckled as he watched the girl desperately holding on to her husband. Amused, he approached her. With a mocking tone, he praised her, calling her a good girl. She understood, didn't she? If she let go, her lover's veins would burst, and he would die. She had to hold on. He watched for a moment longer, savoring her suffering, before turning his attention elsewhere. It was then that a voice cut through the cruel laughter and the cries of the villagers. A voice of calm authority. Someone spoke, saying that one should not be so quick to judge the blood of divine kings. The Margrave's son turned to face the newcomer and was surprised to see a knight approaching on horseback. Recognition flickered in his eyes, and a slow smile spread across his face. Could it be Sir Zebek? His former fencing instructor? With an air of familiarity, the Margrave's son stepped forward, his smile widening. He welcomed the knight, greeting him as an old friend. Zebek, however, remained unfazed. His expression was calm but firm as he questioned the necessity of such cruelty. A nobleman blessed with divine blood should possess a nobility of spirit equal to that lineage. The Margrave's son tilted his head, amused by the sentiment. Did Zebek think his honor would be tarnished by a few nameless peasants? No one would speak of this incident. These fools had dared to insult his dignity over something as trivial as a delayed rain. This was the natural order of things. Unless... Was Zebek planning to spread rumors of his actions? He was, after all, a holy knight recognized by the royal church. Was he truly willing to defame one of noble blood? Zebek met his gaze with unwavering seriousness. The truth, he said, could not be hidden forever. For the first time, the Margrave's son seemed momentarily puzzled. He said nothing, merely watching the knight in silence. A soldier leaned in, whispering discreetly, asking if they should deal with the intruder. But the nobleman waved him off, his confidence returning. There was no need. Instead, he instructed the soldier to bring him a whip. As soon as the whip was handed to him, he turned back to the suffering girl and without hesitation struck her. Again and again. His expression twisted into one of cruel delight as she whimpered in pain. Zebek's eyes narrowed as he watched, but he remained still, his face unreadable. When at last the Margrave's son grew tired, he let the whip fall to his side, his breath coming in slow, measured exhales. A wide smile spread across his face, and he let out a soft chuckle. He looked once more at the girl, who still clung desperately to her husband, and remarked at how truly incredible it was. Then, turning back to Zebek, he grinned. Life should be enjoyed, should it not? With that, he turned on his heel and left, his soldiers following close behind. The night stretched on, the air thick with silence and the weight of exhaustion pressing down on Sophia's shoulders. As she clung to Ivan's body, her arms ached from holding him for so long, yet she refused to let go. Her mind drifted, memories flickering through the darkness like distant stars. She recalled a time when the village was not a place of suffering, when the fields had been lush and the wells had never run dry. Ivan had been by her side then, sitting under the shade of a great tree, flipping a gold coin between his fingers. His expression had been calm, his voice steady as he told her of the Herald clan. The words had settled in her mind, half forgotten until now. That coin, he had explained, was no ordinary piece of currency. It bore the mark of the imperial crest, a symbol tied to those feared figures known as the heralds. Stories whispered about them, calling them soulless, the ones who destroyed holiness itself. She had asked about them, remembering the hushed tales her father had once told her as a child. The heralds, he had said, were not to be sought unless one was prepared to pay the price. Ivan had handed her the coin anyway, his fingers grazing hers as he placed it in her palm. It had been a precaution, a desperate measure he hoped she would never have to use. If ever they were in danger, if there was no other way, she had to draw a triangle on the ground, place the coin at its center, and wait. The heralds would come, they would answer the call. But if the coin was found before then, if the inquisitors of the royal church discovered it in her possession, she would face punishment beyond imagining. The memory lingered in her mind as she stared at the ground where she had traced the symbol with her foot. Only 2 days remained. The weight of those words pressed against her chest, heavy and unrelenting. If she could endure just 2 more days, then perhaps salvation or something far worse would come. Her body, however, had reached its limit. Before she could finish the thought, her vision darkened, and the world around her faded. She lost consciousness, her arms finally giving way as she collapsed to the cold, unforgiving ground. At the same time, in the village where the Margrave's son and his soldiers had taken residence, an atmosphere of satisfaction filled the air. The men, having spent the day indulging in cruelty, now washed themselves, their expressions alight with joy. The sounds of water splashing mixed with their laughter, a stark contrast to the suffering they had left behind. Standing at the center of it all was Zebek, his posture rigid and his face unreadable as he observed the scene before him. Despite the cheerful expressions surrounding him, he found no joy in it. His gaze drifted upward, scanning the sky. The air was heavy, unseasonably warm for this time of year. It was an unsettling heat, pressing down on him as if forewarning something to come. The Margrave's son approached him, his usual smirk in place. He took pleasure in the moment, basking in the power he held over those beneath him. He glanced at Zebek with amusement and remarked that he should smile after all. Wasn't this enjoyable? Zebek's expression remained neutral. Without raising his voice, he stated a simple fact: killing citizens would not bring in much tax. Without people, there would be no land to rule, no economy to sustain the wealth they so greedily desired. The Margrave's son, unfazed by his words, responded with a smile, saying that the growing number of dissatisfied vagrants and thieves would only make things worse. He saw them as little more than pests, a problem that needed to be dealt with before they could fester further. Zebek clenched his fist. The lands under the Margrave's rule had fertile soil, rich and capable of producing abundant crops. There was no reason the people had to suffer when there was an alternative. Why not send the displaced villagers there and allow them to work the land? The Margrave's son raised an eyebrow at the suggestion before tilting his head in mock consideration. His response was dismissive. Why should those born of noble blood be forced to suffer at the hands of such rabble? The peasants were untrustworthy. If given the land, they would only ruin the fields and flee, just as they had tried to abandon the village at the first sign of hardship. Zebek countered that they could be taught cultivating land was not beyond their ability. But before he could finish his thought, the Margrave's son stepped closer, his tone shifting into one of amusement. He reminded Zebek that while they could be taught to work, they could never be taught the generosity of royal beneficence. Wasn't that the lesson the king and the church had instilled in them? The drought, he claimed, was not merely misfortune, it was divine retribution. Had doctrine not made it clear? Some were blessed with fertile lands, while others suffered droughts. Sinners deserved punishment, and those who contributed to the prosperity of the land were the ones who should be rewarded. Everything was done for the greater good. If Zebek truly wished to defy this decree and aid the unworthy, then he was free to try his best. With that, the Margrave's son left, still wearing that same self-satisfied smile. Zebek remained standing in silence. His clenched fists trembled, though whether from anger or frustration, he could not tell. As time passed and evening descended, he found himself walking towards the tree where the villagers had been hanged. When he arrived, he was met with a sight that made his chest tighten. Sophia lay motionless on the ground, her body limp from exhaustion. He exhaled sharply, his frustration bubbling beneath the surface. In the end, it was meaningless. He had tried to rationalize it, tried to see the logic in his actions, but standing there, he felt the weight of it settle over him. Even if the heralds arrived now, what difference would it make? The air around him shifted, an unfamiliar sensation reaping along his spine. Something was wrong. His instincts sharpened, but before he could react, he felt a presence behind him. Before he had time to turn, a cold blade pressed against his throat. His breath stilled, his body going rigid as a low voice cut through the silence. The tone was steady, firm, carrying the weight of experience. The man behind him warned that if he moved, he would die where he stood. Zebek's mind raced. Where had this man come from? His technique was flawless, his approach completely undetected. In a place like this, overrun with soldiers, how had he gone unnoticed? He spoke carefully, questioning the identity of the figure behind him. A herald? The answer was swift and certain. The man clad in black confirmed his suspicion. He was indeed a herald. Without hesitation, he demanded to know Zebek's identity. Was he a knight or a mercenary? Zebek, maintaining his composure despite the blade at his throat, revealed his name and his allegiance. He was a holy knight of the royal church. The herald, whose face remained partially concealed by a mask, tilted his head slightly. He seemed to consider Zebek's words before asking another question. Was he the one who had made the contract? If so, it would be quite the irony for a knight of the royal church to summon those they were sworn to oppose. At that, Zebek's temper flared. The very idea was an insult. But the herald's attention soon shifted. His gaze fell upon Sophia's unmoving form, and something like mild curiosity flickered in his expression. So, this girl was the contractor? If that was the case, then the situation was unfortunate. She was already dead. That meant he had received a coin for nothing, a wasted effort. Still, before he left, he wanted to know what exactly had happened here. Zebek hesitated for a brief moment before speaking. He told the herald that if he would lower his sword and take a few steps back, he would swallow his pride and explain everything. There was a pause, then the herald let out a low chuckle. With almost effortless grace, he moved away, his form seemingly gliding back with the aid of a dark energy that crackled faintly in the air. Zebek's eyes narrowed. The way the herald moved it was unnatural. The shift in energy, the seamless movement, it was not ordinary magic. A phantom? The possibility sent a chill through him. The herald sheathed his sword, his posture relaxed. He stated that stepping away did not make an attack any more difficult for him. He allowed it, however, because Zebek was a knight of the royal church. That alone meant he had some measure of strength, and strength was always worth recognizing. Zebek's gaze remained fixed on him. He asked, still composed, if the herald was a mage. The answer was immediate. Every member of the herald clan was a mage except for him. The response puzzled Zebek. If he was not a mage, then what was he? He demanded clarification. The herald, seemingly amused by the conversation, offered an explanation. The difference between magic and raw superhuman ability was often difficult to distinguish. Zebek's mind turned over the words, trying to grasp their meaning, but before he could press further, he decided on a different approach. He asked for the man's name and his rank within the herald clan. The silence stretched for a few seconds before the herald finally responded. He introduced himself as Aiden of the 108 Spirits. Zebek studied him carefully. The 108 spirits, the lowest rank within the Herald clan. Even so, the power Aiden had displayed was unlike anything he had ever seen. The night stretched on, casting a cold and unfeeling darkness over the land. The village lay in silence, the once lively voices of its people now reduced to whispers carried away by the wind. In the distance beyond the ruins of homes and the blood-soaked ground, Aiden stood at the edge of a high cliff, his gaze sweeping over the city below. The silence between him and Zebek was thick with unspoken thoughts, the weight of the conversation they had just shared lingering in the air like an unshakable presence. The wind howled, carrying with it the distant echoes of a village that had been left to decay under the rule of merciless men. Zebek had spoken of the horrors that had unfolded, the unjust slaughter of villagers, the cruelty of the Margrave's son, and the indifference of those who stood by and allowed it to happen. Aiden, in turn, had listened with an unreadable expression, his mind processing the events, calculating every detail with the sharpness of a man who had witnessed many atrocities in his lifetime. And yet, despite everything, the contract had still been sealed. The terms were clear. Sophia had made a plea before her death, had cast her last hope upon the Herald clan, and now, despite her passing, the deal remained. The question that lingered was what would become of it. Before any more words could be exchanged, the sound of beating wings disrupted the stillness. A shadow passed overhead before landing effortlessly on Aiden's shoulder. The owl, sleek and dark-feathered, blinked with intelligent eyes as it addressed its master. The bird's voice carried an unnatural clarity as it spoke, confirming that it had answered the request. But upon arrival, the contractor had already perished. The coin had been given in vain. It had no purpose now. Aiden barely reacted to the news, clicking his tongue in mild annoyance, while Zebek stood frozen in disbelief. His mind struggled to comprehend what he had just witnessed: a talking owl, a creature that spoke as naturally as any human, yet was bound to the service of a herald. The bird continued, stating that rest was a luxury it could not afford, another mission awaited, and it would depart immediately. Aiden's expression remained neutral, though a flicker of irritation passed through his features. He had little interest in unfinished business, especially one that no longer held any benefit. But before he could turn to leave, Zebek stepped forward, his voice firm, his stance unyielding. The knight could not accept this. The girl had died, and now the herald would simply walk away with the reward, doing nothing. The injustice of it all burned in his chest, and he refused to let it end this way. Aiden, sensing the shift in the knight's demeanor, turned with mild amusement, questioning whether he truly wanted him to fulfill the girl's last wish. Did he realize what that meant? It would mean that the Margrave's son, the very man who ruled with unchallenged cruelty, would suffer. Zebek's grip on his sword tightened. He had made up his mind. He would not allow Aiden to walk away so easily. Drawing his weapon, he pointed the blade directly at the herald, his voice steady but filled with unwavering resolve. If Aiden intended to abandon the contract and leave without consequence, then he would have to face him in combat. Aiden, however, remained unfazed. His lips curled into a slight, knowing smile, as if the very idea amused him. He remarked that it was tragic, truly, to see a knight raise his blade in defense of justice, when that very blade had long since gone deaf to the cries of the innocent. Zebek's teeth clenched at the words, his anger boiling beneath the surface. The herald had struck a nerve, had peeled away the layers of his carefully constructed duty, and forced him to confront a truth he had tried so desperately to ignore. Seeing this, Aiden pressed further, his voice calm yet piercing. Who was Zebek truly angry at? Was it him, the herald, for his indifference? Or was it himself for standing idly by, for watching the suffering unfold and doing nothing? Zebek's fury only grew, but he could not immediately answer. Instead, his mind wrestled with the weight of the accusation, with the question that had been thrown at his feet like an undeniable truth. What could Aiden possibly understand? What gave him the right to speak so easily of suffering? But before he could voice his frustration, Aiden shifted the conversation, his gaze drifting upwards towards the night sky. He asked Zebek if he knew of the constellations, if he was familiar with the legends they carried. The sudden change in topic caught the knight off guard, his frustration momentarily subdued by confusion. Why did it matter? What was the purpose of such a question? Aiden, still looking up, mused that people often looked at the same stars yet saw entirely different things. For some, those distant lights were the remnants of heroes, guiding figures from the past immortalized in the heavens. For others, they were nothing more than dim, flickering glimmers in an endless void. Perception shaped reality, just as some might see the slaughter in the village as necessary justice, while others saw it for what it truly was: senseless cruelty. Stepping away from the cliffside, Aiden made his way towards Ivan's lifeless body, still suspended from the tree where he had been left to die. He observed the corpse with an air of detached contemplation before stating with the same unwavering calmness that in the end there had been no difference between Ivan and the soldiers who had stood by and watched. They had all been caught in the same cycle of power and subjugation. Zebek lowered his gaze, his mind clouded with guilt. He had not acted, had not stepped in when he had the chance. Looking at the reflection in the blade of his sword, he thought of his duty of the teachings of the royal church that had told him to honor those of divine blood. But where had that honor led him? To the execution of innocents? To the protection of men who held no regard for human life? Aiden, sensing the turmoil within the knight, spoke again. He called him a holy knight and declared that he had no desire to fight him. Instead, he raised his blade and cut the ropes that held Ivan's lifeless form. With a single motion, he caught the body before it could fall, handling it with an unexpected gentleness. If Zebek truly felt remorse for the girl who had called upon the heralds, then his sword was not his enemy. The knight said nothing, merely watching as Aiden gathered both Ivan and Sophia, carrying them away from the cruel display that had been made of them. When he reached a quiet patch of earth, he set them down and turned to Zebek with a simple question. Did he have a shovel? Zebek hesitated, unsure of how to respond. Did Aiden intend to bury them? The very idea was an act of defiance, a direct challenge to the Margrave's decree. Kazel had left them to hang as a message, a warning to all who would dare to defy him. To bury them was to erase that message, to show that the cruelty imposed on them would not be honored. Zebek remained silent, and Aiden took his lack of response as an answer. Without a word, he knelt down and began digging with his bare hands. Zebek stood still, watching him. Minutes passed, the only sound coming from the soft rustling of disturbed earth. Then, without another word, Zebek drove his sword into the dirt. Aiden paused, glancing up at him, waiting. Slowly, the knight approached and began digging alongside him. Together, they worked in silence until at last the two graves were prepared. Wooden crosses were placed to mark the resting places, and Aiden, standing before them, uttered a quiet prayer. He called upon the archangel of wisdom, courage, and mercy, asking for grace upon the souls of the departed. Zebek turned to him, his brows furrowed in surprise. The words spoken, they belonged to the Order of the Saviors, a sect that the royal church did not recognize. Aiden, smiling slightly, admitted that he found their ideology to be rather appealing. Zebek shook his head, unable to understand. This man had abandoned his own clan, had turned away from his origins, and now spoke the words of heretics. Yet Aiden, unshaken by the judgment in Zebek's gaze, simply met his eyes with quiet confidence. If Zebek had doubts, then perhaps it was time for him to question why. The night air grew heavier as Aiden remained composed, his expression unwavering. The wind carried the distant echoes of battle, yet his mind was focused solely on the present moment. Zebek stood beside him, still trying to process what he had just heard. If faith alone determined a person's worth, then in Aiden's eyes, bloodlines and nobility were nothing but illusions crafted by those in power. The weight of those words settled heavily on the knight's mind. Before he could respond, Aiden turned slightly, his gaze shifting toward the distance. With calculated movements, he reached for his bow, his fingers smoothly unfastening the strap. Zebek, sensing the change in his demeanor, questioned his intentions, his voice edged with uncertainty. Aiden remained calm, his movements deliberate as he pulled the bowstring, his muscles tensing in anticipation. He spoke with quiet certainty, informing Zebek that someone of importance, someone he was obliged to acknowledge, was approaching. Zebek, startled by the declaration, turned sharply, following Aiden's line of sight. In the dim moonlight, the unmistakable figure of the Margrave's son emerged, his usual arrogant smirk plastered across his face. He exuded an air of confidence, as though he had already claimed victory before the battle had begun. He addressed Zebek with feigned amusement, mocking him for his apparent attachment to the peasant girl. If he had only spoken of his affection sooner, perhaps something could have been arranged. The nobleman chuckled, remarking with disdain that, for a commoner, the girl had been rather attractive. His words dripped with cruelty, each syllable designed to provoke. Zebek clenched his jaw, his grip tightening on the hilt of his sword. His mind raced, calculating the dire situation they were in. 20 heavily armed soldiers surrounded them. Even with all his skill, victory was an impossible dream. He had seen firsthand the ruthlessness of the Margrave's son, and his men. There would be no mercy, no honorable duel. If they fought, they would be slaughtered. Yet despite this, Aiden did not falter. The Margrave's son finally took notice of him, his expression darkening with irritation. With a sneer, he gestured toward the masked warrior, demanding to know his identity. Aiden did not answer. Instead, he moved with seamless precision, raising his bow and loosing an arrow with remarkable speed. The projectile cut through the air, finding its mark almost instantly. A soldier near the back of the group let out a choked scream as the arrow embedded itself deep into his eye socket. His body trembled violently, his cries of agony shattering the once confident silence among the ranks. Every soldier turned, shock painting their faces as they watched their comrade convulse, blood spilling down his cheek. Zebek, equally astounded, struggled to comprehend what had just happened. The precision, the sheer impossibility of the shot was beyond anything he had ever witnessed. Yet Aiden remained silent, already preparing his next strike. Another arrow flew through the air, its speed nearly imperceptible. The soldiers, having learned from the first attack, instinctively raised their shields to protect themselves. The projectile struck with a force unlike any ordinary arrow. One of the soldiers staggered backward, his shield splintering under the impact. A deep crack split through the wooden defense, and as the remnants of the shield fell to the ground, the soldier clutched his arm in pain, his eyes wide with disbelief. The force of the shot had not only destroyed his shield, it had pierced through his armor, leaving him writhing on the ground. Zebek's breath caught in his throat. This was no ordinary archer. The way Aiden's arrows moved, it was as though they were alive, writhing like serpents in the air before striking with unnatural precision. The masked herald, his voice as calm as ever, finally addressed the knight's earlier question. What was it that he admired about the Order of Saviors? The answer was simple: their belief that a person's dignity was determined not by birthright, but by faith and deeds. The mere existence of a noble lineage did not make one righteous. A true leader was not measured by the blood in his veins, but by the way he governed his people. A cruel tyrant who tortured and oppressed his own could never be considered an aristocrat. The words struck a nerve. The Margrave's son, now seething with rage, shouted furiously, his voice laced with venom. His patience had run out. Pointing a furious finger at Zebek, he barked an order. This was no longer a request, but a command. The knight was to kill the so-called freak immediately. At that moment, Aiden moved. With incredible agility, he leaped high into the air, his form silhouetted against the full moon. Every soldier below froze in stunned silence, their heads tilting upward as they tracked his ascent. In that brief moment, Aiden notched another arrow and released it. The shot struck its mark, another soldier's eye, sending him collapsing to the ground with a shriek. Still suspended in midair, Aiden drew 2 more arrows and fired in rapid succession. Both found their targets, embedding themselves into the bodies of 2 more soldiers. Their screams filled the night, their weapons slipping from their hands as they collapsed to the ground. The Margrave's son, his frustration boiling over into unfiltered rage, roared an order: capture him. Kill him if necessary. One of the soldiers, reacting on instinct, rushed to intercept Aiden at the point where he was expected to land. His spear was raised, his intent clear. The herald should have had no way to evade such an attack. Yet, to everyone's shock, Aiden landed lightly on the very tip of the spear. The soldier's eyes widened in disbelief, his grip faltering. With an effortless push, Aiden propelled himself back into the air, moving fluidly beyond the reach of his attackers. While airborne, he retrieved 3 arrows at once, loosing them in quick succession. 3 more soldiers crumpled to the ground, their bodies racked with pain. The battlefield was thrown into chaos, confusion, and terror now gripping the once confident ranks. Yet Aiden did not stop. Another arrow soared through the air, this time missing the Margrave's son by mere inches. Instead, it found purchase in the eye of the knight standing beside him, the force of the impact sending the man reeling. The nobleman's face paled as he realized what was happening. Aiden was not killing them. He was incapacitating every single one of them, rendering them unable to fight. As the soldiers fell one by one, the Margrave's son could no longer contain his fury. His voice cracked with anger as he demanded to know the identity of the masked warrior. Who was he? Aiden landed softly on his feet, moving with ghost-like grace. In one fluid motion, he sprang onto the nobleman's shoulders, standing above him with effortless balance. His voice, still eerily calm, rang through the night. He stated his name simply, without pride, without arrogance. He was Aiden, and he was a herald. A stunned silence settled over the battlefield. The soldiers, battered and bloodied, exchanged glances filled with fear and disbelief. A whisper passed between them, hushed but weighted with realization. He was one of the soulless, one of the feared figures they had only heard about in hushed legends, a herald, and they had made the grave mistake of underestimating him. The knight should not be so quick to anger. Wasn't self-control the very foundation of his discipline? His voice remained calm, yet there was a mocking undertone, as though he found the entire situation amusing. The battlefield was now eerily silent except for the ragged breathing of the few remaining soldiers who were too wounded to move, and the agonized cries of the Margrave's son, who lay writhing on the ground, his hands clutching desperately at his ruined eyes. The nobleman, once so arrogant, so convinced of his own supremacy, had been reduced to nothing more than a pitiful wretch, screaming for mercy where once he had only known cruelty. Aiden remained standing over him, watching with cold indifference as blood pooled beneath the noble's trembling body. He had seen men like this before, those who wielded power with reckless abandon, believing themselves untouchable simply because of their lineage. Yet when faced with true suffering, they collapsed into incoherent, sniveling messes. It was the ultimate irony. He tilted his head slightly, as though considering his next words carefully, then spoke with quiet amusement. The Margrave's son had spent his life relishing in the suffering of others, basking in the power that his noble blood granted him. But in the end, all it had taken was a single blade to strip him of his self-importance. to reduce him to a creature indistinguishable from the peasants he had so despised. Zebek, still gripping his sword, watched the scene unfold with a hardened expression. He had known that Aiden was dangerous, but even he had not expected this level of ruthless efficiency. There was no hesitation in his movements, no pause for contemplation. Aiden had done exactly what he came to do, carrying out his task with a precision that bordered on unnatural. Zebek had fought many battles, seen countless men killed in the name of honor, duty, and war, but there was something different about this. Aiden did not kill for the sake of battle. He did not strike in anger or desperation. He executed judgment with the cold certainty of one who had done it 1,000 times before. The Margrave's son, his body shaking from shock and pain, turned his ruined face toward Zebek, his bloodied hands reaching out in a desperate plea. He called out the knight's name, demanding that he fulfill his duty, that he strike down the monster who had dared to defy nobility itself. His voice was a mixture of rage and terror, disbelief laced into every syllable. How could this be happening? How could a low-born assassin, a mere insect before the might of divine blood, do this to him? Zebek met his gaze, but his expression remained unreadable. He did not move. The Margrave's son's disbelief turned into fury. He screamed at Zebek, calling him a traitor, a disgrace. He was an aristocrat, a descendant of the sacred lineage of Aoos, ordained by divine right to rule over the lesser people. Was he truly going to stand there and do nothing while this heretic defiled him? But before he could finish, Aiden took a step forward, cutting off his rant with a quiet chuckle. The irony was almost poetic just moments ago. This noble had been offering bribes, trying to buy his life with wealth, women, and power. And now, realizing that there was no salvation, he was throwing a tantrum like a child denied his toy. Aiden leaned closer, his voice low but sharp. He reminded the nobleman that his cries were wasted. Aiden had no interest in gold, no desire for noble favor. His title, his lineage, his so-called divine blood, it all meant nothing. Then, without hesitation, Aiden drove the dagger into the noble's remaining eye. A fresh scream tore through the air, louder than before, filled with pure, unfiltered agony. The Margrave's son thrashed wildly, his body convulsing from the pain, his hands clawing at his ruined face. He sobbed, gasping through his cries as his body trembled violently. Aiden let him go, watching as the once powerful noble collapsed onto the dirt, reduced to nothing more than a weeping, broken shell of himself. The judgment had been passed. The imperial law had been upheld. Zebek, gripping his sword tightly, finally spoke. His voice was firm, carrying the weight of both duty and personal conflict. Regardless of what Aiden had done, regardless of whether his actions were justified, Zebek was a knight of the church and the king. The law demanded that Aiden be punished. He could not allow him to simply walk away, even if his deeds had rid the world of filth. Even if he had done what others were too afraid to do, it did not change the fact that he was an executioner outside of royal decree. Aiden let out a quiet sigh, a small smirk tugging at the corner of his lips as he flicked the blood off his dagger and tossed it onto the ground. He remarked, almost casually, that Zebek was certainly different from the other knights he had encountered. He was not blindly obedient, not entirely lost in the dogma of the church. There was a hesitation in his voice, a wavering in his stance that spoke of a man who was caught between two conflicting truths. Zebek's expression darkened, his anger bubbling to the surface. How dare this man, this heretic, mock him? Did he truly believe himself above judgment? Did he truly think that he was the only one who saw injustice for what it was? Aiden spread his arms slightly, his voice carrying an air of amusement. He did not mock Zebek, he was simply pointing out the obvious. The knight was not angry because of what Aiden had done. He was angry because deep down, he knew Aiden was right. The wind had barely settled, and the dust had not yet fully cleared when Aiden vanished from sight, leaving only the faintest trace of the energy that had enveloped him. Zebek stood in place, his mind racing as he processed what had just happened. The words Aiden had spoken lingered in his thoughts, not as an insult, but as a truth that cut deeper than any blade. It was, in fact, praise. The other royal knights were nothing but expendable pieces, men cast aside from their noble houses in a desperate attempt to settle inheritance disputes. They were sent away, not out of duty or honor, but because they were inconvenient. In this, Aiden had not been wrong. The realization sat heavily in Zebek's chest, a weight he could not ignore. He wanted to respond, to argue, to justify his position, but before he could form the words, the masked herald had already anticipated him. Did he truly believe he could keep up with him? That question alone froze Zebek in place, his breath catching as he witnessed the energy that surged around Aiden's body. It was unlike anything he had ever seen before. Something beyond mere magic, beyond even the gifts of noble blood. The sheer force of it was undeniable. And then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, Aiden was gone. The wind rose violently, and in the blink of an eye, he had vanished into the night. Zebek stood motionless, his eyes fixed on the empty space where Aiden had been just moments before. Even for all his skill, for all his training, he could not have stopped him. No one could. No mere knight, no noble general, no warrior of the church. Aiden was something else entirely. The Herald clan was not to be underestimated, and now they had made their move. The battle had ended, yet in truth, the only ones who had suffered losses were those who had stood against them. Zebek exhaled slowly, his grip on his sword loosening as he allowed the tension in his muscles to fade. His gaze drifted toward the horizon where the first light of dawn was beginning to rise. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, he felt something stir in his chest, an ache he could not explain, something deeper than simple exhaustion. Meanwhile, far away, outside the gates of Margrave Castle, a large gathering of people had fallen to their knees. They were refugees, nomads who had lost their homes, men and women who had barely survived the brutal horrors of war, monsters, and bandits. The crowd was a sea of hollow faces, gaunt with hunger, their clothes in tatters, their bodies frail from days, if not weeks, of suffering. One of the men at the front, his voice hoarse from pleading, begged for relief. He knelt in the dirt, pressing his forehead to the cold stone, imploring the Margrave for mercy. They had no food, no homes. Without aid, they would perish. He apologized profusely, knowing full well that his words alone might not be enough. But if they were forced to pay the heavy taxes imposed upon them, it would be their final death sentence. The Margrave sat upon his throne, his expression unreadable as he listened to the pleas of the starving masses. His posture was relaxed, his presence imposing, yet he showed no outward sign of sympathy or irritation. His cold, calculating gaze swept over the desperate faces before him. With a slow, measured tone, he responded, "Shame. That was what they should be feeling. If he were to show them mercy, what would stop others from coming to him, groveling for food and shelter? Were they so shameless as to expect a noble lord to grant them favor when they had done nothing to deserve it?" His words sent a visible ripple of tension through the crowd. The men, who had once spoken with hope, now lowered their heads in silent despair, their hands trembling. One of them, however, dared to raise his voice once more. His plea was desperate, but his tone remained respectful. They were in a hopeless situation, surely there must be some allowance that could be made. The Margrave's eyes lingered on him for a moment before he responded. The blood of the inferior would never change. However, since they were so insistent, he was willing to grant them a deal. The men's expressions flickered with uncertainty, some of them exchanging hushed whispers. Was he serious? Could this be real? The Margrave affirmed it with an air of finality, though his voice carried an unmistakable weight of warning. There would be conditions, and if they failed to meet those conditions, they would not simply be denied mercy, they would be hanged. The air grew thick with tension as the Margrave extended his hand, conjuring a flickering flame that danced above his palm. The magic illuminated his features, casting eerie shadows upon the walls. He assured them that there was nothing to fear. What he asked for was no more than a single page from a certain grimoire. The men looked at one another in confusion, none of them daring to speak. One among them hesitantly admitted that they knew nothing of magic. How were they supposed to retrieve something they had never even heard of? The Margrave's expression did not change. "Even fools should have some knowledge of it," he remarked. It was not something unattainable. If they merely wished, it would answer their call. His conditions were simple. If they could retrieve even a single page of the grimoire, he would grant their village 3 years of tax exemption. Furthermore, he would provide 50 bushels of wheat, barley, and oats. A murmur spread through the crowd, their disbelief growing. Such an offer was unheard of. One of the men, his voice uncertain, cautiously inquired about the name of the grimoire. Surely, they needed to know what they were looking for. The Margrave ceased his display of magic and turned his gaze upon them once more. He answered simply. It was a copy of the Book of the Divine King. Some time later, after the crowds had dispersed and the chamber had grown quiet once more, the Margrave remained seated upon his throne. The flickering torches cast long shadows across the stone walls. From behind the curtains, a figure moved in silence, a serpent, slithering across the cold floor before coming to a halt beside him. Without hesitation, the creature shifted, its form distorting and twisting until it was no longer a snake, but a woman. Her golden eyes gleamed as she observed him, her voice carrying a note of amusement. Was it not rather careless to have mentioned the Book of the Divine King so openly? The Margrave's expression remained composed. "Nonsense," he responded. There was nothing careless about it. The woman tilted her head slightly, her gaze never leaving his. She reminded him that he had searched far and wide for the grimoire, yet rumors of it would only spread further now. If he had intended to secure it, would it not have been wiser to obtain even a single page before drawing attention to it? The Margrave finally turned his eyes toward her, his tone unchanged as he asked what it was she truly wanted. The woman's expression became more serious. She had come to report that his son had fallen. He had been attacked in the Eastern Territories. Before she could finish her sentence, the Margrave cut her off. That was impossible. His forces could not have been defeated so easily. Zebek had been with him, surely he would not have allowed such a failure. The woman's gaze hardened as she revealed the truth. Their enemy had been the Herald clan. For the first time, the Margrave's composed expression wavered slightly. His eyes narrowed as he processed the information. He repeated the name as if confirming it to himself. The Herald clan. They too were searching for the Book of the Divine King. If they sought to rid themselves of their cursed debt, they would need the grimoire just as much as he did, and if they had intervened, then it could only mean one thing. His son was dead. The Margrave sat in silence for a long moment, his fingers curling slowly as he absorbed the news. His son, the one meant to carry forth his lineage, to inherit the legacy of noble blood, had been reduced to nothing. Not only was he blinded, but his very ability to produce an heir had been taken from him, a fate worse than death in the eyes of those who prided themselves on divine ancestry. The woman before him, her golden eyes unblinking, pressed the issue further, her voice laced with curiosity. She had heard rumors that the wounds inflicted upon his son were deliberate, that both his eyes and his reproductive organs had been severed. What would he do now? The Margrave did not hesitate. Slowly he extended his hand toward her, his voice devoid of any emotion as he issued his next command. Border soldiers were to be mobilized at once. The heralds in the surrounding lands were to be hunted down and exterminated, every last one of them. There would be no mercy. The woman, ever composed, nodded and reached forward, taking his outstretched hand in hers. She understood his request and would contact the commander immediately. However, before she could step away, the Margrave tightened his grip, pulling her back. His expression did not shift, yet there was an unspoken weight in the way he looked at her. She would not simply issue the order, she would ensure it was carried out with precision. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he ran his hand across her face, his fingers tracing her cheek as he spoke again. Since his child had been ruined, he would need a new one. Far from the castle, across the barren land scorched by the sun, Aiden walked, the dry earth cracking beneath his boots. The heat was unrelenting, the air thick with dust, and each step felt heavier than the last. His flask had run empty some time ago, and with every passing minute, his thirst became more unbearable. He let out a deep sigh, muttering to himself about the miserable state he was in. If things continued like this, he wouldn't even need an enemy to take him down, he would simply collapse and die of dehydration. What an absurd way to go. He cursed the circumstances that had led him here, all for the sake of fulfilling a contract that had already become a lost cause. 2 days, why had it been necessary to arrange such a spectacle for 2 days? A voice interrupted his thoughts. It was sharp, reverent, yet filled with an air of exasperation. Did he truly dare to speak so insolently to the very mouth of the Emperor himself? Aiden did not even flinch at the rebuke. Frankly speaking, he was past caring about formalities. The senseless death of the Emperor had left him and the other heralds scorned by the world, seen as nothing more than soulless heretics and destroyers of holiness. The people despised them, feared them, and cast them out as though they were monsters. To make matters worse, they had further decided to emphasize their mystique by keeping up this charade of 2-day appearances, as if their presence alone was meant to inspire awe in their contractors. The result? He had been forced to rush here at full speed, abandoning his luggage in the process. Now, he was left with nothing but dry rations, useless without water, and a body on the verge of collapse. He could very well die of thirst or starvation before he ever saw the end of this mission. The presence that had spoken to him fell silent for a moment before offering a quiet apology. But before the words could be completed, both of them felt it, an energy, a shift in the very air around them. Aiden's instincts flared as his hand shot to his sword. Was it a ghost? The question had barely crossed his mind when a bright blue flame flickered before him, its glow illuminating the air like a will-o'-the-wisp. As the light solidified, he saw them spirits, their translucent forms shimmering in the desert heat. He recognized their faces instantly. They were the villagers, the very same people who had suffered at the hands of the Margrave's son. And there, at the forefront, stood Sophia and Ivan, their ethereal figures bowed in greeting. Aiden, caught somewhere between confusion and wariness, nodded in return. He had seen many strange things in his life, but this was not something he had anticipated. He addressed them, remarking that these lands were untouched by the virtues of a king or the blessings of an archangel. Their spirits did not belong here. Their grievances had been avenged, the debt had been paid in full. There was no reason for them to linger. It was time for them to pass on. Sophia, however, raised her hand and pointed behind him. Aiden followed her gesture, his eyes narrowing as he turned. There, amidst the endless stretch of desert, stood an old well. Its stone edges were cracked with age, worn down by time and neglect. He took a few steps toward it, glancing back at the spirits. So that was it. They were offering him water. He let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. They shouldn't have troubled themselves. They had already done enough. They should rest. But the thirst clawing at his throat was relentless, and he had no choice but to accept. He approached the well, a small smile tugging at his lips as he pulled at the rope. Water. That was all he needed. Just one drink, and he could keep moving. But as he peered inside, expecting to see the shimmer of liquid at the bottom, his expression stiffened. There was no water. Instead, buried beneath the sand at the base of the well, A single piece of parchment protruded from the ground. Brow furrowed. What the hell was that? He reached in, pulling the paper free, dusting it off as he examined it. His fingers ran over the worn edges, his eyes scanning the text written across its surface. Recognition flickered in his expression. The words, the symbols. This was no ordinary piece of paper. This was a page from the Book of the Divine King, the very source of divine power. The revelations continued to unfold before him. The true history of the heralds, the truth buried beneath centuries of silence, was written there. Once they had been known as the Arogas, a people who had survived a devastating typhoon on their home continent. Desperate for refuge, they had migrated to the land of Vibras, a continent originally ruled by 8 divine kings, each seated upon their own throne. However, during this era, one among them had seized control, suppressing the remaining 7 kings under his rule. This usurper had been none other than Emperor Isad of the Isad lineage. The emperor's goal had been clear. He sought to erase the sacred royal bloodline, to wipe out all remnants of divine rule. At the same time, a group of foreigners, the Aras, had been searching for a new home. In exchange for their loyalty, Isad had given them a grimoire known as the Song of the Yellow Bird, along with the powerful entity known as the Mouth of the Emperor. In doing so, the Aras had signed an eternal contract, becoming what the world would later call heralds. Thus, their hands were forever stained with divine blood. They had become the executioners of the emperor's will, his personal inquisition, eliminating nobles who had defied his rule. To the people of Vibras, this was the ultimate sin. They believed in reincarnation, in the afterlife, in the endless cycle of rebirth. But the heralds? They had severed that cycle, spilling the blood of kings and rulers in the name of imperial law. And then, the emperor died. His empire fractured into 8 independent kingdoms. The heralds, once feared as the hands of the emperor, were now condemned universally. They were no longer warriors of the empire. They were no longer protectors of the throne. They were nothing more than soulless heretics, the cursed remnants of a forgotten contract. Aiden stared at the parchment, his fingers tightening around its edges. This was why they had suffered. This was why they were hunted, and now, in the sands of this cursed land, lay a single page from that book. Aiden stood motionless for a moment, his gaze lingering on the fading spirits before he nodded in quiet acknowledgement. He had no need for grand gestures or elaborate farewells. These souls had suffered enough in life, and in death, they had lingered only long enough to settle unfinished grievances. Now, their time in this world had ended, and he had no intention of keeping them here any longer. He offered his thanks, his voice low but firm, before urging them to move on, to leave the weight of their past behind and find peace in whatever lay beyond. Their translucent figures shimmered, flickering like embers caught in the wind, and as they faded into nothingness, the air around him grew eerily still. The silence of the desert stretched endlessly, broken only by the faint rustle of sand shifting beneath his feet. He exhaled slowly, turning his attention to the parchment in his hand, his fingers tightening around its worn edges as he considered the implications of what he held. If this page, this single fragment of the Book of the Divine King, had truly found its way to him by fate, then what did that mean for him? Could it be the key to severing the contract that bound him and every other herald to a cycle of endless servitude? He spoke the question aloud, the thought forming into words before he had fully processed it. But before he could dwell on it further, a voice interrupted him. The Mouth of the Emperor, perched on his shoulder as always, scoffed at his phrasing, chiding him for his disrespectful choice of words. It was not a curse. The spirit insisted it was an honest payment of debt, the rightful consequence of the contract their ancestors had signed. Aiden barely reacted to the remark, rolling the parchment between his fingers as he considered its meaning, before speaking again, louder this time, as if declaring his defiance to the heavens. This paper had fallen into his hands through sheer chance, no, through fate. It was undeniable proof that the world had conspired to place it before him, an omen that could not be ignored. Yet even as he spoke, the spirit on his shoulder noted that Aiden's voice lacked the excitement expected of someone who had supposedly received the very thing all heralds sought. Did he not understand? The conditions for breaking the contract had been clear from the beginning: repay the debt by completing services worth 100,000 gold coins and retrieve the complete Book of the Divine King. Only by fulfilling these 2 conditions could a herald be freed from their eternal servitude. That was the dream they all shared, the goal that had kept them moving forward despite the weight of history pressing down on them. Aiden remained silent for a moment, staring at the parchment in his hands, before acknowledging the truth of the statement. This was the path every herald walked, the sole escape from the chains that bound them. Yet despite that, something about it all felt wrong. The book itself was the reason for their suffering, its very existence a symbol of their bondage, and its fragmentation into scattered pages had been caused by none other than his father. Aiden exhaled sharply, irritation creeping into his expression as he forced himself to push the thought away. It was not something he had the luxury to dwell on right now. His throat burned with thirst, his body growing weaker with every passing moment, and the dry air offered him no reprieve. His immediate concern was survival, and until he found water, all other questions would have to wait. Unbeknownst to him, from behind the jagged formations of a nearby rock, he was being watched. Midam of Adol, crouched behind the stone, observed him with piercing eyes. Her hands pressed against the rough surface as she studied his every move. A frown crept across her face as she analyzed the man before her, her thoughts clouded with disdain. So this was him, the son of a traitor, the weakling who had been granted the title of a herald despite having no talent for magic, no exceptional skills to speak of. To her, his very existence was an insult to the position he held, a stain on the legacy of the heralds. Beside her, Ismail, her companion, shifted uncomfortably. He hesitated before speaking, his voice lower than hers as he admitted his uncertainty. Was it really true that Aiden couldn't use magic? That he carried some kind of curse? The rumors had always been vague, and while it was said that Aiden was completely incapable of wielding magic, no one had ever truly confirmed the full extent of his limitations. Midam's lips curled into a sneer, her distaste evident as she scoffed at his hesitation. She had heard far worse things about Aiden. The stories painted him as a pathetic excuse for a warrior, a child who had wet the bed until he was 8 years old, who had struggled to even draw the string of a bow. Someone like that had no right to call himself a herald. How could someone so pathetic ever hope to fulfill his duty? Ismail, still watching Aiden from behind the rock, seemed troubled by her words. He hesitated again before suggesting that maybe they should just return home. There was no real reason for them to be here. Even if Midam was related to the original contractor, what business did she have involving herself with a low-ranking herald? They were apprentices. They had no obligation to interfere. But Midam had already made up her mind. A sharp smile formed on her lips as she raised an arrow between her fingers, twirling it slightly before setting it against the bowstring. If they were already here, they might as well test him. Ismail's expression darkened immediately. His voice rose slightly, laced with protest. Apprentices were not allowed to attack heralds. It was a rule, unspoken yet universally understood. Even if Aiden was of a lower rank, even if he was unworthy in their eyes, an attack would be seen as an offense. But Midam's smirk did not waver. Who cared? If she defeated him, if she proved that he was unfit, then she would take his place. Someone capable would finally hold the title of herald, and she would be the one recognized. To her, this was not just a test, it was a challenge, a way to prove that Aiden did not deserve to stand where he did. Without another word, she loosed the arrow. It cut through the air, flying toward its target with perfect precision. Aiden, still standing in place, did not move. Midam grinned, quickly ducking behind the rock, expecting the impact. But then a sharp pain struck her forehead. A rock, hurled with calculated force, slammed directly against her skull, and she let out a loud cry, pressing a hand to her face as she staggered backward in shock. Ismail's eyes widened in disbelief as he turned toward her, calling her name in alarm. Midam, seething, barely registered his concern as she glared in the direction of the attack, one hand still clutching her forehead. Aiden stood before her, his quiver in hand, his expression unreadable. He had moved without a sound, his presence so seamless that she hadn't even realized he had gotten so close. Without a word, he lifted the quiver slightly, his sharp gaze meeting hers with quiet intensity. Midam, still holding her throbbing forehead, forced a stiff smile, trying to mask her anger. It was just a greeting, she insisted, a simple test of skill. But deep down, she was rattled. When had he gotten here? She hadn't felt his presence at all. More importantly, had he really just caught that arrow with his quiver? Aiden's gaze did not waver as he turned his attention to both of them, his expression as cold as ever. He asked for their names, and after a brief pause, Midam answered first, avoiding direct eye contact, while Ismail hesitantly followed suit. They introduced themselves as apprentices sent to assist him, a statement that made Aiden's expression darken with silent irritation. Help? He scoffed at the thought. He tossed their arrows onto the ground before them, his voice steady as he questioned their presence. With these? Midam, regaining some of her composure, smirked and remarked that his quiver had looked empty. Wasn't she just helping? Aiden exhaled sharply, looking away. It was obvious they were bored in the Holy Lands and had asked to be sent here for entertainment. He told them to go home. Midam's face twisted with fury as she snapped back, "Are we children?" Aiden turned back toward them, his eyes narrowing. For a herald, lineage means nothing. Aiden observed them in silence, his gaze sharp and calculating, before finally raising his hand in a deliberate motion. His serious expression left no room for misunderstanding as he addressed them, questioning their intentions. If they were apprentices, then they were here to assist him, yet they had fired arrows at him without hesitation. Did they intend to help him, or were they asking for discipline? He let the weight of his words settle, his tone edged with warning. If they had done this outside the Holy Lands, in any other region, the consequences would have been severe. A mistake like that would not be brushed aside so easily. Madame hesitated for the first time since their encounter, her thoughts spinning as she took in the situation. He was not at all like the rumors suggested. Everything she had heard painted him as a fool, a weakling, a disgrace to the heralds, but now, standing before him, feeling the sheer force of his presence, she knew those rumors were wrong. This man was... His voice hardened as he demanded an apology, his expression dark and unyielding. The tension in the air thickened as he clenched his fists, waiting for her response. He made it clear that if they wanted anything from him, they had to show respect first, whether they came from Aras or even from the ranks of his enemies. Their allegiance did not matter, but they had to decide which side they stood on. Madame clenched her teeth, her frustration evident as she lowered her gaze. Swallowing her pride, she spoke her name, acknowledging her mistake, and apologized formally for her disrespect to the herald Aiden. She also revealed that she was a roguess. Aiden's stern expression did not waver as he accepted her apology, but he made it clear that from this point forward, she was to refrain from playing with weapons, unless she intended to kill. Outside the Holy Lands, the world did not forgive carelessness. If she aimed at someone, she had to be prepared to take their life or lose her own. Madame's shoulders tensed at his words, her gaze dropping momentarily before she nodded in understanding. She knew now that he was not someone to be taken lightly. Turning away from them, Aiden stepped forward, moving along the stone path with steady, purposeful strides. He told them they could go back. He had no need for apprentices. He would not report their actions, nor would he involve them in his affairs. They had been given a chance to leave, to return to the safety of their training, but that was where their part in his journey ended. For a moment, neither of them moved, the weight of his words sinking in. Then, he suddenly stopped, his brow furrowing slightly as a thought occurred to him. He turned back to face them, his expression shifting into something almost amused. He had been so caught up in the confrontation that he had almost forgotten his biggest concern. His lips curled slightly into a smirk as he casually asked if they had any water. The moment he said it, Madame's entire posture changed. Without hesitation, she raised her voice and issued a challenge. Ismail's face drained of color, his hands lifting in alarm as he turned to her in shock. His voice rose in panic as he called her name, urging her to reconsider. This man was dangerous. What was she thinking? Madame, however, ignored his protest. Her thoughts burned with conviction. Aiden was different from the rumors. He was strong, proud, and undeniably intelligent. If she backed down now, if she turned away from the challenge, wouldn't that be the same as admitting cowardice? A herald could not be afraid of conflict. She could not allow herself to hesitate now that she had seen the truth. If she wanted to prove herself, if she wanted to claim her rightful place, this was her chance. Without flinching, she declared her name once more, this time issuing a formal challenge to Aiden for the position of herald. The weight of her words sent a wave of silence through the air, thick and unmoving. Aiden's gaze hardened, his fingers curling slightly as he clenched his fists. His silence was heavy, the unreadable depth in his eyes making it impossible to tell what he was thinking. Ismail shut his eyes tightly, his breath unsteady as he raised a trembling hand. He had known Madame for a long time. He had never seen her this determined before. Aiden let out a slow breath, resting a hand against his head, deep in thought. The mouth of the Emperor rested above them, watching from the sky as the events unfolded. Aiden exhaled through his nose, already regretting the direction this was taking. He had no intention of wasting his time on a pointless duel. This wasn't some child's game. The way these apprentices acted was proof enough that a certain someone had led them astray. He placed his hand on his hip, looking at Midam with a mix of exhaustion and irritation. If she won, she would take his position, but did she even understand what would happen if she lost? Madame stood her ground without hesitation, placing her hands on her hips as she spoke with unwavering confidence. She knew exactly what was at stake. Everything she had, including her life, would belong to him. And she was ready for that. Aiden exhaled sharply. Of course, this wasn't just about proving her worth. She truly believed that she could replace him. He knew his reputation wasn't perfect, and he had no doubt that people doubted his capabilities, but he hadn't been given this position for nothing. The fact that Madame thought she stood a chance at defeating him only proved that she underestimated him. Aiden's gaze darkened as he gave her one final warning. If she wanted to back out, now was the time. The fact that Arail had defeated him once did not mean that she could. Madame did not move. She took one deliberate step backward, placing distance between them. Ismail's panic grew, his voice rising again as he called her name, but it was already too late. Madame's voice rang clear and strong through the open space as she announced that there were exactly 100 steps between them now. The duel had begun. The mouth of the Emperor, glowing under the heat of the sun, declared the match official. The herald must accept the challenge. Madame's confidence wavered slightly as she stiffened in surprise. Had that really been the Emperor's mouth? Aiden scratched his cheek absently, clearly caught off guard as well. Was the spirit serious? Ismail's expression darkened with fear, his body trembling as he lowered his head. This was bad. The emperor's lips were a spirit given to every herald, and once it had confirmed a duel, there was no longer a way to refuse. Midam had spoken recklessly, but now, there was no way to back out. Midam's frustration bubbled over into anger. She had no choice now. She had to win. The battle had been decided before the first move was made. Later, as the dust settled, Aiden stood over the battlefield, his flask of water finally in hand. Around him, his two so-called challengers sat in defeat, their bodies covered in dirt, their expressions burdened with disbelief. Ismail sat with his head bowed low, his teeth clenched as he struggled to process what had just happened. The fight had been unlike anything he had ever seen. During the battle, Aiden had not even used a bow in the way they had expected. Instead, he had rapid-fired stones, launching them from his bow with such force that they had become deadly projectiles. Midam had gritted her teeth, trying to anticipate the attacks, but his speed had overwhelmed her completely. In the final moment, she had raised her hand in desperation, forming a magic seal around herself as a shield, but it had been too late. The battle had already been decided the moment she underestimated him. As the reality of her loss settled in, she finally understood the rumors had been wrong. Aiden fired the stones from his bow with unwavering confidence, each projectile glowing with a faint energy that crackled through the air. The sheer speed and force of the shots left no room for hesitation. Midam, feeling the weight of the attack bearing down on her, instinctively raised her hand, conjuring a magic seal to shield herself. Sweat trickled down her forehead as she gritted her teeth, eyes darting frantically to track the stones zipping past her, each one barely missing her by mere inches. Panic clawed at her chest. This was nothing like what she had prepared for. Across the battlefield, Ismail watched in growing disbelief, his mind struggling to comprehend what he was witnessing. Hadn't everyone said that Aiden was incapable of magic? And yet, here he was, utilizing a technique so refined that it mimicked the legendary art of the Yellow Crane. Was this really just raw skill, or had Aiden somehow unlocked something no one else had seen? As Ismail's thoughts spiraled, his gaze drifted to the protagonist, now casually drinking from his water flask as though the fight was already decided. Midam exhaled sharply, regaining her footing as the dust settled. Her grip tightened around the hilt of her sword, her body tense with determination. This wasn't over. If she could predict his movements, she could turn the fight around. Her sharp eyes scanned the terrain, searching for the right moment. Then, she saw a large stone positioned in such a way that it could cut off Aiden's movement. This was her chance. She lunged forward, raising her sword high, ready to strike him down. In her mind, she had already won. She had calculated everything, placed herself in the perfect position, but as her sword carved through the air, she felt nothing. The moment of victory was stolen from her as Aiden's form dissipated into dark smoke, vanishing as if he had never been there at all. Her breath hitched, confusion gripping her. What was this? Where had he gone? Ismail's panicked voice rang out behind her, but before she could react, Aiden had already moved. His hand caught her wrist mid-motion, twisting it upward, forcing her defensive stance to crumble. A second later, his free hand slammed into her chest, sending her hurtling backward. She crashed against the hard stone with a force that sent dust and debris flying into the air. The duel was over. The mouth of the Emperor declared it so. Ismail, eyes wide with rage, turned on Aiden, his voice breaking with anger. How dare a traitor's descendant humiliate someone of noble blood? Blinded by his emotions, he charged forward, ignoring the consequences, but before he could take another step, the voice of the Emperor's mouth rang out once more. Not only had Midam lost, but because of his interference, he too now belonged to Aiden. The words struck them both like a hammer. Midam, still sprawled in the dust, trembled with rage and humiliation, unable to meet Aiden's gaze. Her fingers curled into the dirt, her body shaking as tears burned behind her eyes. This couldn't be happening. She had lost everything. Her grip tightened around the dagger at her waist. If she could not win, then at least she could die on her own terms. But before she could make the fatal cut, a sharp crack split the air. A stone, launched with precision, struck her wrist, sending the dagger flying from her grasp. It clattered to the ground, and Aiden, still seated on a nearby rock, barely lifted his gaze as he remarked that he knew she would try something like this. Midam's shoulders shook, anger overtaking her as she let out a wordless cry of frustration. Aiden closed the cap of his water flask, finally rising to his feet. He had no interest in dragging this out further. With a dismissive tone, he announced that the lesson had been more than enough. They were free to go. Midam and Ismail, still reeling from the shock of their loss, stared at him in disbelief. He wasn't claiming them? He could have enslaved them under herald law, yet he was letting them walk away? Aiden merely shrugged, stating that it would be easier to pretend that none of this had happened. A duel of this nature, if reported, would only cause complications in their records. They should be grateful. With that, he turned on his heel, continuing his path into the mountains without looking back. But Midam, anger still burning in her chest, refused to let it go. Raising her voice, she demanded an explanation. How could he just throw away a trained fighter like her? She had value. Was he really that arrogant? Ismail, exhausted and humiliated, covered his face with his hands, muttering for her to stop. But Aiden, without breaking his stride, simply chuckled. He barely spared her a glance as he threw one final remark over his shoulder. If she had been as strong as Ariel, she wouldn't have lost. The truth was simple. She was not worth keeping. And with a smirk, he added that there were plenty of men in the world who liked young girls, but he was not one of them. Aiden walked with steady, deliberate steps, his mind still lingering on the events that had unfolded. His final words to Midam had not been meant as a cruel dismissal, but as a reminder of the harsh realities of the world they lived in. There were many cultures where early marriage was allowed, and as unsettling as it was, she needed to understand that the world did not operate on her ideals or her expectations. If she planned to challenge people recklessly, she needed to be prepared for every possible consequence. Next time, she should think twice before challenging someone to a duel. In truth, it was better not to challenge anyone at all. If she despised someone enough to want them gone, she could simply kill them in their sleep rather than risk everything in a formal battle. It was a cold truth, but a truth nonetheless. Ismail, walking beside them, was caught off guard by Aiden's unexpected shift in demeanor. He had assumed Aiden was a man of few words, indifferent to everything around him, yet now he was speaking far more than expected. And strangely enough, he seemed to genuinely care, not in a sentimental way, but in a practical survivalist sense. Midam, still reeling from the experience, lowered her head, her hands shaking slightly. But then, as she raised her head once more, something changed in her expression. There was no longer defiance in her eyes, but rather something akin to admiration. This was not the man everyone mocked behind his back. Ismail's voice suddenly rose in alarm, snapping them back to reality. Before them, something unexpected appeared: a contract of service. The agreement between the Emperor and the Aras, a pact where both sides provided what the other required, yet with a cost so severe that any betrayal meant facing a fate worse than death. What had once been a symbol of loyalty and honor had twisted into a terrible curse, an inescapable cycle of subjugation. Even after the Emperor's death, the contract remained unchanged, forcing the Arogas to continue serving as heralds, forever trapped in their roles. The first sign of decay in this pact had appeared during the battle for the throne of the Kingdom of Zas, a battle in which the Herald clan had interfered. The Aras had emerged victorious, securing a copy of the Divine King's book. But then, in an act of unthinkable betrayal, a single man had stolen the book and disappeared into the heart of the World Mountain Range. That man was Air. The betrayal had sent shockwaves through the clan. The men who had once stood beside Air had turned on him, demanding that he return what he had stolen, warning him that the curse of the contract would destroy him if he did not comply. If he failed to return the copy of the Divine King's book, he would suffer unimaginable torment. The Herald clan had threatened him with every conceivable and inconceivable punishment, but in the end, hope had been shattered into dust. Air had torn the book apart, scattering its remnants throughout the world. And in doing so, he had become the first victim of the curse of the contract, a punishment that defied the very laws of nature. As a result of the curse, he had been forced to bear twins, despite possessing a male body. Those twins were Aiden and Ael. Of the two, Ael had become the strongest herald in the history of the clan, while Aiden was branded a fool. The rumors about him had spread far and wide, but who had started them? Aiden clenched his fists as the thought formed in his mind. Who had been so determined to shape his reputation into that of a disgrace? Taking a step forward, he exhaled slowly before making himself clear. He had no intention of taking Midam or Ismail with him. They needed to stop following him. Midam, however, raised her hands, her voice sharp as she refuted his claim. They were not following him. Instead, they had been tasked with delivering something. She reached into her belongings and handed him a letter, explaining that it was from the head of the Sasma region. Aiden's brows furrowed slightly as he took the letter, immediately recognizing the name. That old bastard. The head of Sasma had never liked him, and Aiden had been hoping to avoid the unnecessary drama that came with his reports. Tearing open the letter, he quickly scanned the contents. It confirmed something alarming: copies of the Divine King's book had been reappearing. Aiden was to locate and secure them, and his actions would be taken into account for future recommendations. Aiden's jaw tightened slightly as he processed the meaning behind the message. So the other heralds already knew about this. Looking up from the letter, he turned toward Midam and Ismail, raising his hand slightly as he questioned them. If the copies were resurfacing, then surely they had heard about this, right? Midam's expression brightened as she grinned, confirming it with an almost reckless enthusiasm. But then, with a smirk, she added that it was his father who had betrayed them all. Before she could finish her sentence, Ismail let out a terrified scream, interrupting her. In one swift motion, he kicked her leg, cutting her off instantly. Midam recoiled, glaring at him angrily, loudly complaining about the pain. Why was he attacking her? Aiden sighed, lifting a hand to silence them both, so they both knew. That changed things. Lowering his gaze, he muttered his decision. They would have to go to Sasma next. They needed to greet the head of the region in person. He had to see for himself just how much the others already knew. Midam, still frustrated from Ismail's interference, watched as Aiden turned his back to them, beginning his march forward. With a huff, she grabbed Ismail's face, squishing his cheeks in annoyance before turning to Aiden with a pout. She raised her finger, her expression now laced with mild desperation, and asked if Aiden realized something. If they were heading in the same direction, then technically, there was no reason they couldn't just continue following him. In exchange, she would tell him everything that had happened in the clan during his absence. Aiden chuckled softly, amused by her persistence. Smiling slightly, he responded simply the road didn't belong to him. If they wanted to follow, they could. Midam's entire demeanor changed at his response. With childish excitement, she raised her leg triumphantly, loudly declaring that this was perfect. Sometime later, as they rested among the open fields, the sky stretching endlessly above them, the group sat in silence, their bodies weary from travel. Aiden, leaning against the soft fur of an animal, stretched his arms lazily, exhaling with a loud sigh. His body ached, but the brief moment of stillness was welcomed. The peace, however, did not last. Without warning, he told them to wake up. Ismail, who had barely begun to drift off, slowly opened his eyes, groggy from exhaustion. As they resumed their journey, Aiden pointed ahead, his voice calm but firm. There was a stream nearby. In the distance, between the grass and scattered stones, the clear waters of a small stream shimmered under the light. The water shimmered under the midday sun as Aiden's companions knelt near the stream, collecting what they needed to quench their thirst and refill their flasks. The brief moment of respite, however, was quickly shattered by a voice calling out to them. A group of men stood at a distance, their expressions a mix of arrogance and amusement. One of them, a man with a cruel smirk, stepped forward, his voice thick with mockery as he asked who had given them permission to drink from their stream. Aiden, unfazed, raised his hand in a calm gesture, making it clear that he had no intention of fighting. He wasn't interested in unnecessary conflict. Instead, he asked what the men wanted in exchange for the water. The leader's smirk faltered slightly before his expression twisted into something nastier. Raising his weapon onto his shoulder, he sneered, claiming that they wanted everything Aiden and his group possessed. Aiden exhaled slowly, his patience thinning. Just to be sure, he asked if they were not considering some kind of compromise. But the man only laughed, mocking Aiden for speaking so much, claiming he talked too much for an adult. Another man, an older one, cackled alongside him, glancing at Aiden's mask with clear amusement. What was the purpose of it? Was Aiden trying to be some kind of clown? Their jeers quickly turned into orders. The leader raised his finger and commanded his men to take Midam alive and kill the rest. The moment the words left his lips, the underlings shouted in agreement, preparing to carry out their orders. But fate had already turned against them. It wasn't long before the same men who had so boldly threatened them were now kneeling in absolute terror, their voices raw with pleas for mercy. Their bodies trembled, their confidence shattered. They cried out, swearing that they were innocent people. Ismail's brows furrowed in confusion as he asked aloud, were they not bandits? Had they not just threatened to rob and kill them? One of the kneeling men placed his hand over his chest, his voice breaking with emotion, as he claimed that they were just recruits. He began to explain, but his words cut off abruptly, as if he were unsure of what to say. What he did reveal, however, was troubling. They had been forced into this life. The Margrave's son was gathering people from everywhere, sending them out to search for some kind of book. The old man, still gasping for breath, placed his hand on his chest and demanded to know how were they supposed to find something they had never even seen. Their orders were meaningless, and so they wandered aimlessly, forced to follow orders or face consequences. And in their misfortune, they had stumbled upon Aiden and his group, whom they now called noble people. Midam, standing over them with her arms crossed, was far less convinced. Her gaze hardened as she pointed out that anyone could claim to be a victim. What if they were just common thieves looking for an excuse? Aiden, however, lifted his hands slightly, his eyes sharp with thought. He doubted that was the case. Neither travelers nor merchants frequently used this road, which meant that robbing people here was a waste of time. These men were sent here for a reason. Midam's frustration reached its peak. Her patience finally snapped as she pulled her dagger from its sheath, her eyes burning with fury. It would be easier to kill these freaks and silence them once and for all. Why were they even debating this? But Aiden's voice cut through her anger, sharp and unwavering. He ordered her to stop. They could not kill them without reason. Midam hesitated, then exhaled deeply, bowing her head slightly before apologizing, though the confusion in her eyes remained. Ismail, still struggling to comprehend what Aiden was doing, spoke up, his voice filled with disbelief. Was he really sparing them? Even if they were innocent, leaving witnesses behind would only lead to problems later. But Aiden remained firm. He had no intention of killing them for convenience. Everyone deserved a second chance. The captured men, sensing an opportunity, eagerly agreed. Their smiles returned, and their voices rose in relief, declaring that the protagonist had a kind heart. One even boldly called him an aristocrat, praising his mercy. Aiden's eyes darkened as he glared at them, his patience wearing thin. With a single fluid motion, he struck the old man across the face, the force sending him crashing into the dirt. Aiden grabbed his wrist tightly, his grip unforgiving, and muttered that it was a clean hit, one accurate enough to cost a man his eye. His warning was clear. One wrong move and they could lose much more than their dignity. The man, trembling, looked away in fear. His voice cracked as he reminded Aiden that he had promised to spare them. But Aiden's smirk did not waver. He calmly clenched his fist, remarking that mercy came in many forms. Only pain would teach them to abandon their ways even if they did not truly feel remorse. Midam, watching the scene unfold, crossed her arms and nodded. This would do. Ismail, despite his earlier protests, agreed with her. The men screamed in agony as Aiden delivered their lesson. However, their suffering wasn't over. Just as their cries began to subside, another voice roared across the field, this one filled with pure rage. The man who had earlier threatened Aiden struggled to his feet, surrounded by his comrades, his expression twisted with hatred. His voice shook with fury as he spat insults, calling Aiden a freak. Leaning against one of his comrades, he swore that if he ever crossed paths with Aiden again, he would make him suffer, but his words never reached their end. A huge hand suddenly clamped around his head. His body stiffened, his breath caught in his throat, and before anyone could react, his head was ripped from his shoulders in an instant. The scene turned to horror. The old man, who had once laughed so arrogantly, turned in terror. His face paled as he stared at the monstrous figure looming over them. Goldo. The creature lifted the old man's leg effortlessly, inspecting him with a chilling indifference before tossing him into a bucket nearby. Goldo's voice rumbled, speaking as if the entire matter was trivial. This was food. He needed to carry food. And before the remaining man could even struggle, Goldo grabbed him as well, declaring that he belonged to him now. The man's screams pierced the air, but they were short-lived. Goldo crouched down, flinging the body into the waiting arms of the goblins, who eagerly began devouring him. Laughter echoed from Goldo's massive frame as he glanced toward the distance, his eyes widening slightly. Beyond the battlefield, in the distance, a village came into view. Goldo's grin faded as he muttered in dread, his voice heavy with realization. There were people in that village. The fortress loomed in the distance, its walls thick and unyielding, its structure vast enough to house an abundance of meat, a statement that sent a chill of unease down Aiden's spine. The reality of what Goldo had meant by that remark was far too clear. However, there was no time to dwell on it. Moving forward was the only option. In the wake of their earlier encounter, the group now rode their animals in silence, the rhythmic sound of hooves against dirt providing an unspoken sense of urgency. Midam, breaking the quiet, spoke first, her tone lighter than before. She admitted that, at first, she had believed Aiden was far too lenient, yet now, after seeing the results, she was surprised by how effective his approach had been. A smile crept onto her face as she acknowledged that, upon reflection, it wasn't such a bad strategy. Not only had they avoided unnecessary bloodshed, but they had also gained weapons in the process. Aiden, resting his hand on the soft fur of his mount, responded in a quieter voice, remarking that it was difficult to understand the depth of fear for those who had never truly lost anything. A simple injury at first glance seemed like nothing more than pain, but for those men, it had been something far deeper. The people they had once seen only as helpless victims had now become a source of terror in their minds. And that was an opportunity. If fear could change their perception, perhaps it could also force them to reflect on their actions. Ismail turned toward him, his brows furrowed in confusion. A chance to repent? He was shocked by the idea. Was Aiden really saying that he had not only spared those men, but had also given them an opportunity to make amends? Aiden did not respond immediately. Instead, he exhaled, slipping down from his mount and onto the ground, his expression unusually distant. Looking away, he admitted that their previous conversation had left him uneasy. Madame, intrigued, asked what conversation he meant, her curiosity evident. Aiden's voice hardened as he reminded them of what the captives had revealed. Kazel was searching for a copy of the Divine King's book. The name carried weight, and the realization sent a wave of concern through both Midam and Ismail. Kazel was already far behind in the race for the throne. That meant he was desperate. If he sought the magical knowledge hidden within that book, it was clear that he intended to level the playing field by any means necessary. Aiden ran a hand over his face, sighing. Power. Political figures were always obsessed with it, and that obsession made them dangerous. It was a risk he couldn't ignore. As a precautionary measure, while they were within Count Kazel's territory, he would have to abandon the mask of a herald. Without hesitation, Aiden removed the mask from his face, revealing what lay beneath. His companions' reactions were immediate. Their voices rose in surprise as they took in what had been hidden from them all this time. Aiden stood with the wound on his eyes fully exposed, holding the mask in his hand, his face unreadable. Midam and Ismail stared in shock, both struggling to find the right words. Did he truly have no eyes? How was he able to move so fluidly, fight with such precision without sight? Ismail, still struggling to process this, voiced his disbelief. Aiden never stumbled, never moved as if he was blind. How was that possible? Aiden, adjusting the cloth that now covered his face, spoke without emotion. He did not know. Since birth, he had been able to see without eyes. That was simply his reality. Midame's confusion quickly shifted into curiosity. Without hesitation, she moved toward him, studying his face closely. Aiden, sensing her sudden shift in behavior, stiffened. What was she doing? If she had something to say, she should speak plainly. Midame, after a brief pause, offered a completely unexpected observation. She tilted her head, musing that, if anything, the scars actually suited him. Aiden's entire expression changed. His brows twitched in irritation as he demanded to know what she was talking about. Midame shrugged, as if it were an obvious fact. If she had to guess, he was probably handsome before. But then, something happened, and he lost his eyes. A tragic accident, perhaps. In her opinion, however, it was better to have scars than a beautiful face with unpleasant eyes. His smile gawked at her in disbelief, turning to her with a look of pure exasperation. That was rude. No matter how she phrased it, it was rude. But Aiden, his expression momentarily unreadable, merely stroked the fur of his animal, his voice calm but heavy. She had said the same thing the person who had inflicted these wounds had said. Midame froze, her body tensing slightly. Who was that person? Aiden's answer was simple. Ariel. The memory lingered in his mind as he explained. Ariel had called it unnatural to have nothing where something was meant to be. Since he no longer had eyes, he might as well imagine something beautiful in their place. And so, she had cut his face to make it better. Silence stretched between them. Aiden adjusted the cloth over his face once more, his tone unwavering. Thanks to that, he could successfully pretend to be blind. When he was alone, it was never an issue. Midame, after a long pause, suddenly grinned. Loudly, she agreed with him. If that was the case, then she would simply help him keep up the act. Aiden, walking ahead with a stick in hand, waved off the idea, telling her not to bother. As they continued forward, the outlines of a village appeared in the distance. Before long, they arrived at its gates. Ismail, adjusting the strap of his briefcase, observed the area, noting the long line of people waiting to enter. Aiden, gripping his stick, muttered that it had been a long time since he had been here. Midame, smiling as she folded her hands behind her head, looked at him with amusement. This was where the Imperial Road began. What did he think about that? Wasn't it great that they were standing at such an important starting point? Aiden's voice turned sharp, cutting her off instantly. He told her to shut up. With an unreadable expression, he muttered that, at this moment, he was nothing more than a solitary traveler, and they were just children who had crossed his path. But even as he spoke, a strange tension gripped his chest. His body tensed, a familiar sensation creeping up his spine. Something was wrong. He turned slightly, his expression hardening. Was it like this the last time he was here? Ismail, caught off guard, blinked in confusion. Aiden's question lingered, unanswered. The knights at the gates had stopped checking belongings, and instead, they were staring at something or someone. The knight crouched low, gripping a man's belongings in his gloved hand, inspecting them with intent. Midame, her arms crossed, watched the scene unfold with cold disdain, her voice sharp as she declared that they were simply stealing. However, Ismail, observing with growing unease, shook his head in disagreement, noting that he did not remember such behavior the last time they had been here. Aiden, listening carefully, exhaled slowly, his thoughts running deeper than the immediate scene. He understood what was happening. This was not simply theft for greed. They were looking for something. And judging by the thoroughness of their searches, they were not taking any chances. But before Aiden could fully form his conclusions, a gruff voice interrupted his thoughts. A nearby man, worn and weary, glanced toward him with curiosity, then scoffed. Was Aiden blind or something? Aiden, tilting his head slightly in the man's direction, responded flatly that it wasn't entirely true. These orphans, he gestured vaguely toward Midame and Ismail, were simply guiding him on his journey. The man grimaced, his features twisting with misplaced sympathy. That must be hard. But Aiden, uninterested in the sentiment, instead pressed forward with a real question. What exactly was going on here? The man sighed, lifting a tired hand as he questioned whether they had truly not heard the rumors. The Book of the Divine King, its pages were appearing across the world. Aiden's head turned sharply in the man's direction, his body stiffening. The Book of the Divine King. The man nodded grimly, confirming that the rumors were true. Word had spread that some herald clan had stolen the original and created copies, and now, those copies were surfacing in unexpected places. Count Kazel's forces had begun a full-scale hunt, searching every town, every road for even the smallest fragment of the book. The sheer madness of it was undeniable. Aiden, forcing himself to remain outwardly calm, narrowed his thoughts. So the hunt had begun. This was no longer an isolated effort, it was spreading, reaching deeper into the world. But before he could contemplate the full implications, the commotion escalated. The same man who had been searched earlier, desperate and furious, clutched the knight's arm, his voice rising in outrage. He demanded to know why his money was being taken. Weren't they searching for the book of the Divine King? What did his savings have to do with that? The knight sneered, his expression darkening before striking the man brutally across the face, sending him sprawling onto the dirt. The knight's laughter was sharp and cruel as he lifted his hand, mocking the crowd. The grimoire could take many forms, he jeered. What if it had taken the form of money? His companion, standing beside him, gritted his teeth before offering a mock reassurance they would examine all valuables and, if nothing turned out to be a part of the book, the belongings would be returned. The man's face twisted with pain and disbelief, but he did not resist further. He had no choice. Coet, a small child, stood nearby, her tiny fists clenched in anger. Watching the injustice unfold, she finally shouted loudly, her voice filled with pure defiance. This was stealing. Stealing was wrong. The knights needed to give it back. The crowd tensed, fear washing over them as they saw who had spoken. The knight turned toward the little girl, his expression darkening into something twisted and cruel. He cracked his knuckles slowly, stepping toward her as he mocked her innocence. Surely she knew that speaking against them was punishable by beatings? Before he could get any closer, her father rushed forward, grabbing her protectively, his voice filled with terror. He pleaded desperately for her to stay quiet, his eyes wide with fear, knowing full well what was coming next. But the knight offered no mercy. He delivered a brutal strike to the father's gut, sending him collapsing to the ground, gasping for breath. Coet, horrified, threw herself over him, calling out to him frantically. The knight sneered, his voice dripping with disdain as he questioned whether the man had ever learned how to raise his child properly. This was what happened when children were not disciplined, and with a simple flick of his wrist, he motioned for the next person in line to step forward. Madame's body trembled with barely restrained fury. Her fists clenched so tightly her knuckles turned white. These monsters! Her voice shook with anger as she hissed, calling them freaks under her breath. Ismail, still shaken, turned to her, knowing exactly where her thoughts were leading. They were going to fight, weren't they? Midam, still fuming, nodded sharply, but before they could move, Aiden raised his hand, stopping them in place. As they hesitated, a sudden change in the atmosphere caught Aiden's attention. One of the men in the background broke away from the group, rushing to the knight's side. He moved close, his voice hushed as he whispered something into the knight's ear. The knight's body tensed immediately, his features twisting into unease. Aiden watched carefully, his senses sharpened. Something was wrong. The men gathering their belongings, the rushed whispers, all of it pointed to one conclusion. Then, one of the men pointed toward the horizon, his face pale with terror. The old man standing nearby followed his gaze, his expression turning to shock as he asked in disbelief what was happening. Another man, clearly distressed, muttered a single question. Why were people packing their things so frantically? Aiden, without hesitation, finally spoke the truth. Ogres had been spotted nearby. The entire crowd stiffened in horror. Their whispers turned into panicked shouts, fear spreading like wildfire. Aiden's sharp hearing had picked up on their secret conversations, and now, the reality of the situation was fully exposed. The men, eyes wild with fear, immediately turned toward the village gates, their voices rising in desperation. They pleaded loudly, demanding that the gates be opened, but no response came. And then, somewhere far beyond the forest's edge, deep in the darkness of the trees, a different conversation unfolded. Knights stood near horses and carriages, their armor glinting beneath the filtered light. A man, known as Targi the Bastard, sat comfortably, his hands resting on his knees, a satisfied smile playing on his lips. He glanced toward the knights standing before him, speaking in a casual, almost bored tone. Had they secured the gates properly? One of the knights nodded firmly, his voice filled with certainty. Yes, no one would be getting out. Targi, still smiling, lifted a hand and pressed it against the carriage window beside him. The wood creaked under the pressure of his fingers. He had received word that there were no copies of the Divine King's book here. That meant that their work was finished. They could take everything they had collected and leave. The knight nearest to him stiffened, his voice rising in urgency as he called Targi's name, but he was already gone. Targi remained utterly unfazed by the fear in the eyes of his men, his confidence a wall of indifference against their growing panic. When one of them, shaking, asked what they were supposed to do, he simply stretched, resting a hand behind his head as if the matter were nothing more than a mild inconvenience. "Fight them off, of course," he said, the smirk on his lips barely concealing his amusement. What had they been training for if not situations like this? The man who had spoken, however, was not reassured. His face was pale, his lips trembling as he muttered that their so-called training had only lasted a single day. They were not soldiers, not knights, and they had never once faced ogres in battle. If they were truly going to fight, then at the very least, they should allow the civilians outside to enter. Let them take shelter within the gates, and allow those who could help to fortify the defenses. His voice wavered with desperation, but his plea was genuine. He would even take command of the defense himself, if that was what it took. But his words only served to irritate Targi. The noble's smirk twisted into something cruel as he cast a disdainful gaze over the man. He was not a knight, not a noble, not even a proper soldier. What right did he have to give orders? What arrogance, what foolishness. Crossing his arms, Targi coldly informed him that it was not his place to speak of such things. Then, with an ominous chuckle, he mockingly entrusted the entire situation to the man. "Fine, take care of it," he sneered. "Defend the village, if you think you can." Without another word, he turned away, stepping into his carriage, leaving the man to stand there, hollow with dread. As the sound of horses fading into the distance filled the air, the man was left alone with the consequences of Targi's decision. His hands trembled at his sides, his breath coming in short, panicked bursts as he stared at the retreating figures. And then, slowly, a new sensation crawled up his spine, a deep rumbling tremor beneath his feet. The earth shifted, rolling in a steady, unnatural movement. He turned his gaze toward the far horizon, his stomach tightening with dread. Something massive was coming. The realization settled over him like a death sentence. He and the others had been left as bait. They were never meant to survive this. His breath hitched as his fingers dug into his arms, a futile attempt to steady himself. Where were they being dragged? Would the ogres really devour them like animals? The thought sent him into a spiral of horror, his body curling inward, his legs drawn close to his chest. He did not want to die like this. Desperately, he pressed his hand against the wooden wall of the cart, searching for something, anything to confirm what was happening outside. His eyes darted to a small crack, a sliver of space where light seeped through, and he peered through the gap, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. What he saw froze the air in his lungs. Ogres, towering, monstrous brutes, their bodies thick with muscle, their skin a mottled mix of gray and green, their jaws large enough to snap a man in two. They moved with a terrifying purpose, their clubbing feet shaking the very ground, their guttural voices booming across the landscape. One of them, grinning wickedly, lifted a massive club and let out a deep, rolling laugh. "Meat!" he bellowed, his sharp teeth glinting under the moonlight. The others roared in unison, their laughter a monstrous symphony of hunger and delight. The old man watching from the cart felt his stomach turn to ice, his fingers gripping the wooden frame so tightly that his nails bent against the grain. This was no attack, no simple raid. This was a feast. And they, the villagers, the defenseless, the abandoned, were the main course. Meanwhile, at the village gates, Aiden and his companions stood their ground, prepared for what was to come. The torches lining the dirt path flickered against the cold night air as villagers hurried about, their hands clutching whatever weapons they could find: spears, axes, makeshift blades fashioned from farming tools. Aiden, his face unreadable, simply stated the truth. They were coming. Farther along the road, a woman turned back, her gaze falling upon Ismail. Without hesitation, she handed him a lantern, urging him to guide his uncle and sister well. There was a quiet urgency in her voice, the kind that carried the weight of unspoken fears. Ismail, grinning despite the tension in the air, accepted the task with confidence, promising that she needn't worry, he would take care of them. Aiden watched the exchange in silence, deep in thought. He had noticed something that had been growing increasingly apparent to him over time. People were much friendlier when he pretended to be blind. Some time ago, before the true battle had begun, a young man had stepped forward, raising his hand to rally the villagers. His voice rang clear through the night, calling out for those who were still standing. The knights and mercenaries had abandoned them. That meant they had no one to rely on but themselves. If they were going to survive, they needed to stand together, to fight as one. Gather the able-bodied, prepare to defend. Buy enough time for the elderly and wounded to escape. Every second mattered. A father, standing with his young daughter, clenched his fists and vowed that he would fight for her. But the little girl, unfazed by his determination, frowned and stated plainly that he could barely slice an apple properly. Aiden, listening to it all, felt something within him shift. Midam, her anger boiling over, could not hold back her rage any longer. The knights, the so-called protectors of the people, had abandoned them without hesitation. The sheer injustice of it burned in her chest. They should be ashamed. But Aiden, his expression unreadable, merely responded calmly. This was not cowardice. This was a sacrifice, a calculated move to buy time, to allow others to escape. In the minds of those knights, this was not betrayal, it was a twisted kind of mercy. Midam turned to him, shocked at his words. How could someone from Airgas from the Herald clan sympathize with the people of Vibras? Yet Aiden did not waver. He understood. And in his understanding, he made his choice. Dark energy wrapped around his form, swirling like a shadow given life, and then he was gone. His staff struck the ground, standing in place where he had once been. Midam and Ismail, wide-eyed, called out in alarm. Where had he gone? And more importantly, where was their uncle? Night had fully descended, blanketing the village in darkness. At the gates, the villagers stood, their makeshift weapons clenched in trembling hands. The air was thick with tension, the scent of sweat and fear mixing with the cold breeze. A man turned to the captain of the defense, his voice barely above a whisper. There were too many. The response was silence. Then, a thunderous voice split through the air. "Goldo!" The monstrous ogre, standing at the front of his horde, threw his massive arms wide, his toothy maw twisting into a wicked grin. His clawed hand shot forward, pointing toward the baskets filled with captives. "Meat! It's meat!" A sickening laughter spread through the horde, their voices rising into a chorus of monstrous hunger. Goldo turned toward the village, his massive form silhouetted against the moonlight. "There's a fortress inside," he murmured, almost dreamily. His eyes gleamed then. With a deafening boom, he raised his foot and slammed it into the earth. The captain, standing at the forefront of the village's last line of defense, raised his voice in a desperate command, his tone laced with both fear and resolve. The ogre leading the attack, a towering brute, its grotesque form illuminated by the flickering fires of the battlefield, had to be taken down. The moment the words left his mouth, archers drew their bows in unison, the tension of the strings creaking as they aimed at the massive beast. Then, with a single word, the air was filled with arrows, cutting through the night like a storm of death. But the ogres were prepared. The King of Fangs, a sinister figure lurking within the chaos of the battlefield, watched from behind a makeshift barricade of captured bodies, gripping his ornate staff with both hands. His lips curled into a malicious grin, his dark robes shifting as he lifted the staff toward the sky. With a bark of command, he ordered his followers to advance. The ogres, emboldened by his words, raised their weapons high and surged forward with deafening roars, the sheer force of their charge shaking the earth beneath them. The captain's expression twisted into one of grim determination, his hand tightening around the hilt of his sword. He turned sharply, his voice cutting through the chaos, shouting for his men to defend the gate at all costs. Anyone who approached the walls was to be shot down on sight. But the ogres, clever in their brutality, had no intention of merely scaling the walls. One of them, a hulking mass of muscle and rage, lifted its shield, deflecting the hailstorm of arrows as though they were nothing more than raindrops. Another swung its enormous axe, the force of the strike sending a shuddering crack through the air. The wooden barricades trembled under the impact, splintering slightly but holding. Golda, standing amidst the chaos, grabbed a boulder, its weight insignificant in his massive hand, and with a grin, he hurled it straight toward the gates. The rock crashed into the walls with devastating force, sending shards of wood and stone flying in all directions. The villagers holding the barricades screamed in terror, their hands slipping from the wooden planks as the defenses began to crumble. The captain, wide-eyed, barked another desperate order: fire. But it was already too late. Aiden, watching from above, knew that hesitation would be their downfall. Without a moment's delay, he leaped from his vantage point, cutting through the air with precise speed. His target? The King of Fangs. With a sharp movement, he drove his boot into the cult leader's back, pinning him against the dirt with a force that sent a cloud of dust rising into the night sky. The King of Fangs let out a choked gasp, his fingers scrambling to grip his staff as Aiden's weight bore down on him. But before the cultist could regain control, Aiden vaulted back into the sky, narrowly avoiding a massive stone hurled at the gates by Golda. Below him, the panicked screams of the villagers filled the air as they dove out of the way, barely escaping the earth-shaking impact. Aiden, landing smoothly, immediately turned to the captain, his voice firm. "I'll assist in the defense." The captain, still reeling from the chaos, stared at him in stunned disbelief. The way he moved, the way he fought it, was unlike any soldier or mercenary he had ever seen. "Who are you?" he finally managed to ask. Aiden didn't hesitate. "I am a herald of the Emperor." A hush fell over those who heard his words. The captain's face drained of color, his grip on his sword tightening as he stumbled back slightly. "A herald? You're one of those heralds?" The battlefield, however, did not wait for further explanations. Aiden turned away, his bow in hand, and in one swift movement, he took aim. The arrow, guided by unseen precision, pierced straight through the eye of an approaching ogre, sending it howling in agony. The brute's massive hand slammed into the ground, cracking the earth beneath it as smoke and dust billowed into the air. But its rage was undeterred. Roaring in unholy fury, the beast lifted its club high, preparing to bring it down upon Aiden and everything around him. Golda, watching from the side, let out an ear-splitting roar of his own, lifting his monstrous hands toward the sky. "I will kill you and everyone else!" His massive foot slammed into the ground, shaking the battlefield as he charged forward with terrifying speed. But Aiden was already in motion, his eyes locked on the King of Fangs. The cult leader, grinning despite the chaos, suddenly threw his head back and let out a chilling laugh. Standing before the basket of his slain comrades, he lifted his staff, his eyes burning with twisted zeal. He spoke words laced with madness, his voice thick with hunger and triumph. "This is the book of the Divine King." His body convulsed, his mouth foaming as if possessed, and before anyone could react, something horrific happened. From his very flesh, a monstrous, grotesque creature erupted, its gnarled limbs twisted and covered in jagged teeth. The beast's massive maw snapped hungrily, and without hesitation, it lunged. In a single horrifying motion, the tentacled creature devoured Golda whole. The ogre, still mid-roar, let out a strangled, gurgled scream as his massive form was dragged into the abyss of the beast's body. His voice, once so loud and dominant, was suddenly silenced. Aiden, watching from below, felt his stomach tighten in alarm. The sheer wrongness of what he was seeing sent a deep, primal instinct screaming in his mind. His fingers tightened around his bow, but he did not fire. This was no ordinary enemy. This was something far worse. Kneeling, he placed his palms against the cracked ground, his entire body tensing as the air grew heavy with something unnatural. The King of Fangs, now something beyond human, let out an unearthly shriek as the beast curled its many limbs around its new host. Its jaws snapped hungrily, saliva dripping like molten acid. One of the men watching let out a strangled gasp, his voice barely above a whisper. "What is that?" Aiden did not look away. His voice was calm, but it carried the weight of something far more ominous. "This," he said slowly, "is the divine cult." The King of Fangs let out a guttural laugh, his grotesque form twisting as he ripped his head free from the monstrous body that had begun to devour him. With a sickening snap, his jaw unhinged, and his grin stretched unnaturally wide, his glowing staff pulsing with a sinister light. Aiden's heart pounded in his chest as a bright beam shot forth from the staff, piercing straight through his chest. Pain flared, but something else caught his attention, the page of the Divine King's book. His hand instinctively pressed against his chest, feeling the faint energy of the artifact react to the strike. The King of Fang's smile twisted into gleeful malice as he turned his gaze toward him, his voice dripping with arrogance. He demanded that Aiden surrender the page. If he complied, he would at least be granted a quick death. But before the villain could even finish his sentence, an arrow sliced past his face, missing him by mere inches. Aiden stood tall, bow in hand, already preparing his next shot. His expression remained unreadable, but inside, he was analyzing every detail. That beam of light, was it truly guiding them to the page? That meant this battle was no longer just about survival. This cult wasn't just here for chaos or destruction, they were after the Divine King's book. But why? What would these monstrous cultists even do with it? His mind raced through possibilities as a tentacle shot toward him, the foul smell of decay flooding the air. He dodged at the last second, rolling aside as the ground cracked beneath the sheer force of the attack. An ogre nearby, covered in thick drool and patches of slime, roared in frustration, its massive hands swinging wildly in rage. The King of Fangs, infuriated by Aiden's resistance, raised his staff once more, calling upon a surge of unholy energy. Aiden's body tensed as he landed near a broken sword, still embedded in the tentacle of one of the beasts. Without hesitation, he grabbed it, feeling the weight of steel in his grip. With a swift motion, he slashed at the writhing limb, slicing it cleanly in half. But the moment his blade met the creature's flesh, a sizzling noise erupted. His weapon corroded instantly, the metal melting from the acidic properties of the monster's body. Aiden grimaced as he tossed the ruined blade aside. Even steel couldn't hold against this thing's blood. The King of Fangs, unshaken by the loss of his appendage, let out an enraged shriek. He slammed his staff into the ground, sending a wave of writhing darkness spiraling toward Aiden. But before the wave could engulf him, a new sound cut through the battlefield, the whistling of arrows. The captain of the village's defenders had given the order. The archers, despite their doubts about Aiden, had come to a collective decision deal with the monsters first. The church and its laws could come later, but if they didn't stop these things now, there would be no one left to enforce justice. A hailstorm of arrows rained down upon the battlefield, piercing into the tentacled monstrosity and embedding deep into the King of Fang's flesh. The monster howled, its deformed body twitching as the cult leader screamed in agony. Aiden, watching with a smirk, raised his own weapon. If they were going to give him arrows, he might as well put them to use. With expert precision, he notched one and let it fly, aiming directly for the wounded beast. But Aiden was far from done. He wouldn't just rely on arrows alone. Reaching down, he grabbed one of the severed fangs, the massive, jagged teeth that had once belonged to the now flailing monster. With a sharp grin, he hurled it straight at the King of Fangs, the projectile embedding itself deep into the villain's chest. The cultist gasped, his eyes wide with disbelief. How dare he? But Aiden's voice cut through his shocked silence, his words calm yet mocking. They were your fangs. I'm just giving them back to you. The King of Fangs let out a guttural growl, his rage reaching its peak. His mouth foamed, his body trembling with unstable energy. He threw his head back, screaming at the sky, declaring that he would not just be any king, he would be the Divine King. His body began to twist and shift, his form expanding with grotesque mutations. But Aiden was already one step ahead. With a flick of his wrist, he grabbed another severed fang, this one even larger than before. His eyes gleamed with certainty as he took a steadying breath, then hurled it with all his strength. The jagged tooth cut through the air like a blade, its trajectory true and unyielding. It struck the king of fangs directly in the mouth, shattering through bone, tearing through flesh. The creature froze, its eyes wide with horror, realization dawning too late. Aiden's voice rang through the battlefield one last time, his tone firm, unshaken. It just so happens that I'm a slayer of holiness, and then, with a final, sickening crack, the king of fangs' head snapped backward, his body convulsing, and then, with a thunderous crash, his lifeless form collapsed to the ground. The battlefield went silent. The defenders, the villagers, the surviving soldiers all watched in stunned disbelief. The once unshakable monstrosity now lay dead at Aiden's feet, its body twitching in its final moments. The Fang King, his last breath escaping him, gazed at something unseen, his expression twisted in fear. His body stilled. Aiden, standing tall, exhaled slowly, lowering his weapon. It's over. Aiden knelt down, his fingers stretching toward the fallen staff, the energy surrounding it still faintly pulsating with the remnants of its former wielder's power. But before he could grasp it, a chorus of angry voices filled the air. The villagers, now free from the immediate terror of the battle, turned their resentment and fear toward him. A heartless apostate, one of them spat, his voice thick with disdain. Others joined in, their words laced with the raw desperation of those who had lost everything and needed someone to blame. Aiden's gaze flickered toward them, the weight of their accusations settling upon him, yet his expression remained unreadable. Clutching an arrow between his fingers, he considered their hostility for a brief moment, then thought to himself how rude they were being. It would be a mistake to fire upon them now, but that didn't mean he wasn't considering it. The captain, stepping forward with a grim, unwavering stare, demanded to know Aiden's intentions. Why had he killed the monsters? The words carried not gratitude but suspicion, as if Aiden had orchestrated this entire disaster for some unknown, sinister purpose. A murmur of agreement rippled through the survivors, their emotions turning into a wave of unease and resentment. One man, his face still streaked with dust and blood, pointed an accusing finger at him. It was him! He brought them here, he shouted, his voice cracking under the weight of his fear. His comrades nodded, their gazes shifting uneasily between Aiden and the destruction left in the wake of the battle. Another, gripping his bow tightly, asked aloud where had the monsters even come from. Did no one find it strange? To them the answer was clear. It had to be his doing. He was a blasphemous atheist, a servant of no divine law, and thus he had to be at fault. Aiden stood motionless, his body tense as he listened to their accusations, their hatred, their fear of what they did not understand. He didn't try to justify himself, nor did he offer them comforting words. Instead, he simply placed his finger against his cheek, his head tilting slightly in thought. Did they truly believe he had summoned the creatures? That would be amusing, if not for how utterly ridiculous it was. They know, don't they? He mused aloud, his tone casual, almost indifferent. He was only doing his job, fulfilling his duty for imperial gold coins. Some people used those very same coins to help them, and yet now, they stood here condemning him. His words sent a wave of confusion through the gathered men. Their anger, though still present, wavered under the weight of his implication. The captain, brows furrowed in thought, looked toward the villagers. Someone had made a wish, a contract with the heralds for aid. 1 gold coin exchanged for his services. But who had done it? Who had called upon one of the heralds, knowing full well that such an act was considered heresy in the eyes of the royal church? The old man, his hands clenched against the splintered wood of a nearby fence, leaned forward, his voice sharp with fury. Was it one of you? He demanded. His gaze swept across the gathered survivors, but no one spoke. Aiden, watching the scene unfold, finally shrugged and offered a simple answer. I can't say. The old man's teeth clenched audibly, his face twisting with anger. The tension grew thick. Some among them still wanted to fight him, still wished to strike him down for the crime of simply existing in a way they did not understand. Aiden let out a slow sigh, his patience wearing thin. So, can I leave? He finally asked, his voice light, almost mocking. Or did they wish to challenge him in the name of the royal church, the same noble-backed faith whose representatives had been the first to flee the moment the real danger appeared? One man, barely able to stand, snarled through bloodied lips, warning him not to defame their faith. Aiden raised a hand in mock surrender, his voice smooth as he agreed. Of course. You're all faithful believers. There was no point in arguing with zealots. He turned away from them, his eyes settling on a wounded survivor who had collapsed to the ground, his body shaking as he wept from exhaustion and relief. Aiden studied him for a brief moment before sighing. You should be grateful, he muttered, tilting his head. You've been given a second chance. The man's body trembled violently, his sobs growing heavier. Without waiting for further conversation, Aiden vanished. The night stretched long and dark, the sky a canvas of swirling clouds as Aiden moved swiftly across the ruined landscape. His boots barely touched the ground, his movement as effortless as a shadow in flight. Smoke and dust still lingered in the air, remnants of the battle left behind. The Emperor's mouth, floating above him, broke the silence. "A gold coin?" the spirit asked, its tone edged with curiosity. That was a lie, wasn't it? Aiden's answer was instant, spoken without thought. Of course. There was no hesitation, no remorse. It was necessary. If he had told them the truth, they would have feared him for the rest of their lives. He had given them an answer they could understand, something that fit within their limited worldview. The Emperor's mouth hummed, pondering his response. "Doesn't that anger you?" the spirit pressed. He had saved them, and yet they had treated him like a villain, a monster. But Aiden's voice remained calm, absent of anger or resentment. People are weak. He understood that far better than most. They respected him only when he pretended to be blind, only when he seemed harmless. It was no different from the villagers' actions earlier. They thanked him when it suited them, and cursed him when it didn't. That was simply the way things were. They deserved his gratitude, not his anger. He exhaled, rolling his shoulders as he continued his journey forward, exhaustion finally beginning to weigh on him. Not only had he traveled here for nothing, but he had also been forced to fight a monster for free. No gold coins, no reward, just another thankless task. What a waste. Then in the distance, something caught his attention. A bright light, flickering gently. Familiar voices. He came to a halt, his eyes narrowing as the figures came into view. Ismail, smiling happily, waving toward him. Midam, standing nearby, her expression eager. "Aiden," Ismail called, his voice cheerful despite the night's horrors. Aiden sighed, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten. "Here we go again." Aiden draped the cloth over his shoulders, settling into the fabric with a slow exhale. His movements were relaxed, yet his sharp gaze lingered on the horizon, as if weighing the weight of unseen burdens. With a smirk, he remarked that life without a little bit of goodness was boring. Midam, standing nearby with her usual self-satisfied grin, scoffed at his words, countering that Ismail was just boring all on his own. Her confidence remained unshaken, despite the comrade in question calling out her name in protest, his tone carrying the same melancholy acceptance as always. Aiden turned, his fingers briefly adjusting his mask before pulling it free, exposing his unfazed expression. He eyed them both, and acknowledged their survival, noting that it seemed like the people had let them go without much resistance. Midam grinned, puffing her chest as she explained that the villagers had, at first, tried to stop them, claiming that they were too young to be dealing with monsters, even small ones. But as usual, Midam had insisted that they were more than capable, and eventually the people had left them alone. Ismail, ever the optimist, added enthusiastically that they were kind-hearted folks, even gifting them a torch for their journey, though, he admitted with a knowing look, had they known the truth about them being from Aris, things might have gone very differently. Before he could finish his thought, however, Midam cut him off, placing her hands on her waist with exaggerated pride. She declared that it was only natural that people would be drawn to them, especially her. After all, she was beautiful. Aiden, watching her antics with amusement, let out a chuckle. "Oh?" he mused, raising a brow. "Is that really the reason? Not because you're still just a child?" Midam's face flushed with irritation, her voice rising as she snapped back at him. "I'm already 13, she argued, folding her arms stubbornly. "In the northern lands," she continued, "there was already a queen her age." Aiden, still unimpressed, merely held out a staff to her, cutting off whatever further argument she was about to make. She blinked in surprise, her curiosity piqued, before taking it with reverence. Her eyes sparkled with fascination as she asked, "Is this a magic staff?" Aiden confirmed it belonged to the imitator, watching as Midam's enthusiasm bloomed. She examined it closely, muttering to herself about how much effort it would take to truly understand its properties. But at the same time, she groaned about being completely exhausted. That was when a realization hit her, her expression lighting up with excitement. She turned to Aiden, her eyes bright and hopeful, asking if this meant he finally recognized her as his student. Aiden, half amused, half exasperated, waved off her eagerness, remarking that he was merely doing a favor for a fellow countryman. But Midam, ever persistent, pressed further, loudly declaring that in exchange, she wanted a favor from him. Aiden sighed, rubbing his temple before stating tiredly that she could inspect the staff tomorrow. Then, in a blur of motion, he leaped into a nearby tree, his figure swift and weightless. Midam, startled by his sudden departure, looked up in confusion and asked where he was going. Aiden, already turning his head to the side, answered simply but firmly. There was no time to waste, they needed to move. Midam, still processing his abruptness, furrowed her brow before asking, "Move where?"
The commander stormed out of his tent, fury blazing, his voice echoed, demanding answers for the lost loot. He pointed angrily at his subordinate, accusing him of failure, shouting this was not part of their deal. The soldier trembled before their gathered ranks, voice cracking, explaining how they'd been ambushed with no warning or defense. The commander sneered, unrelenting in blame. insisting someone take responsibility while the troops stood frozen in silence. A calm voice answered, chewing quietly, "If you say so, then it must be my fault." Silence followed. The commander ordered 2 soldiers to follow tracks. He was done playing games with incompetent fools. The dark-haired man calmly agreed, but revealed something worse. One of his personal belongings had vanished as well. With tension rising, the commander demanded clarity. The man's eyes narrowed as he simply said, "Can't tell you." The commander scoffed, dismissing its importance. If it wasn't worth mentioning, it couldn't be worth retrieving either. Turning away, the man requested orders for the next village. He planned to find the thief himself. The commander, growing irritated, warned the man not to make things harder than they already were. The subordinate frowned, questioning why he had to obey, accusing the commander of giving unreasonable orders again. A smirk spread across the man's face. His tone darkened. "That's fine. I'll do it myself," he whispered coldly, threatening to attack the next village and blame it entirely on the commander's authority. In a flash, he grabbed the commander by the throat, rage finally breaking through his calm surface. With no hesitation, he stabbed the commander. Shock rippled through the camp as blood stained his chest. Staggering back, the commander clutched the wound, calling the attacker a bastard with his last strength. Soldiers froze, horrified. As their captain collapsed, none dared move while the dark figure stepped forward again. The man smiled grimly, assuring them not to worry. The dagger had been enchanted by a witch. A strange mark glowed on the commander's body. Dark magic spread like roots, twisting him unnaturally inside. From the cursed mark, a monstrous spider emerged, pulsing with violet energy, legs twitching with deadly intent. The commander screamed in agony, the creature digging deeper. Soldiers recoiled, horror flooding their pale faces. The dark-haired man turned calmly, saying the spider's effect would keep the commander alive for now. The commander howled, staggering up, demanding answers, his voice trembling as corruption overtook his body. He raised his arm, trembling violently. Something was changing beneath the surface, and it wasn't under control. The commander's eye glowed violently. He screamed as power surged inside, his body no longer his own. He collapsed, convulsing unholy energy twisting through his limbs, the corrupted spider completing its grip on him. The man crouched beside him, whispering that this was only the beginning of something far worse. He revealed the truth. The commander now belonged to him, a puppet bound to serve completely. The commander struggled up, trembling, eyes wide, finally asking what his captor truly wanted from him now. Nearby soldiers watched in fear, unsure whether to intervene or run from the terrifying display unfolding. The commander gasped, coughing blood, kneeling as the man's will crushed him with silent pressure. With a cold gaze, the man declared his next move: attack the public station immediately. He would reclaim what was his and seize the thief who dared interfere with his possessions. Far away, unaware of the danger approaching, the thief traveled alone along a peaceful mountain road. Beneath a lone tree, 2 young travelers rested peacefully, unaware of the threat rapidly approaching behind them. A sharp voice cut through the morning breeze, announcing the time and demanding they wake immediately. Startled, the blonde girl yawned and stretched, her tired expression showing she'd barely slept through the night. She sat upright beside the boy and their beast, blinking slowly as the owl watched silently. Noticing his stillness, she leaned closer, concern rising. Something about Azadine's silence felt wrong this time. Azadine stood, puzzled, when the girl suddenly asked, "Did you always have 2 shadows before?" He turned, surprised. "No," he replied, recalling the merchant camp theft and the strange events since. The girl pulled out a wrapped object, explaining it was what the stolen merchant had dropped. She handed it to Azadine, requesting he examine it, suspecting it was cursed or something worse. Azadine nodded and focused, summoning faint blue energy as he began to inspect the mysterious artifact. Azadine concentrated on the artifact while the girl asked gently, "Do you see anything inside it?" A surge of magic responded. In his mind, swirling green and black energy formed a chaotic vision. He explained the color's meaning. It wasn't red mana, which meant the artifact wasn't bound to humans. Focusing deeper, Azadine identified its purpose with growing certainty. The artifact had been created for one reason. "It's searching," he said quietly, raising his head. "It's meant to track someone, and it's still active." Another companion examined the artifact, noting it was delicate, something easily broken with a single sharp strike. Still, Azadine insisted the creator was skilled. Power radiated from its core despite the rushed construction. He concluded the tool, though made quickly, outperformed most magical devices they had encountered in the past. It was built to hunt, a tool designed to find someone no matter how far they ran. With resolve, Azadine suggested they investigate whoever lost it, hoping to discover the enemy's true objective soon. From a distant ridge, Azadine observed the camp below, uneasy about the sudden shift in behavior. He noticed the difference immediately. The soldiers moved with urgency now, unlike the day before. Weapons were sharpened, armor inspected. They weren't patrolling anymore. They were preparing for a full-scale battle. Azadine concluded their goal was the same: recover the artifact at all costs. No matter the method, he expected caution after the loss, but brute force? That meant they were either desperate or overconfident. Azadine crouched silently, eyes scanning the horizon. Behind him, mercenaries waited impatiently for his command. He spotted enemy banners near distant cliffs. Turning slightly, he whispered, "They're preparing to attack the next village." Ariel crossed her arms, frowning. "A public stage station village?" she asked, concerned by the bold enemy strategy. Azadine nodded grimly. "That village's resources exceed normal supplies. They must believe it's worth risking everything today." Adjusting his sword belt, Azadine muttered, "Maybe." He stepped forward decisively. The confrontation was now unavoidable. Azadine adjusted his cloak. The falcon perched calmly, awaiting his silent command before their dangerous approach. Bright skies stretched endlessly as Azadine approached the massive stage station, its silhouette rising against harsh desert winds. Night fell quickly. Strange stars glimmered as caravans gathered below, preparing for something far beyond routine trade. Crossing the archway, Azadine blended into the crowd. Sharp eyes scanned unfamiliar faces, searching for hidden threats. A mysterious figure whispered, "A blind man I see. Tread lightly." Azadine nodded silently. Danger was everywhere. Azadine entered cautiously. They really let in paid pilgrims for free? Ariel frowned, sensing something felt wrong. Watching the vibrant night sky, Azadine whispered, "Though we're deceiving them too." His grip tightened unconsciously. They moved deeper into the bustling market. Azadine's eyes darted between merchants, guards, and heavily armed travelers nearby. Ariel pointed. "Hey, that's the wagon from Kohaki Peddlers Association." Relief crept into her tired voice. Azadine narrowed his eyes. "The Peddlers Association, huh?" His instincts warned him. Trouble always followed those merchants. Azadine tightened his grip. Ariel hummed casually ahead, unaware their peaceful moment was about to collapse. The boy stood firm. "So, you're the youngest herald?" Their leader scoffed, clearly unimpressed and challenging. "You're just a child of traders." "Don't act important," the blonde boy sneered, fists clenched aggressively. Whispers echoed the greatest genius they ever had became a herald at age 13. Taunting voices filled memories. He recalled painful lessons, trauma, broken ankles, relentless training, but Ariel's resilience and ambition surpassed everyone's wildest expectations. Ariel appeared in his thoughts again, untouchable and fierce. Even then, she stood above them all. He hesitated, realizing Ariel was far more dangerous and influential than a simple, strong individual could become. His eyes narrowed sharply. Memories rushed back, scenes where Ariel's commanding presence silenced even the most stubborn voices. Ariel. The name escaped his lips unconsciously. He leaned back, frustration building behind his carefully composed expression. Suddenly, loud footsteps echoed nearby. His head snapped toward the door. "What's this noise?" he muttered cautiously. Not long ago, the festival square bustled peacefully, but hidden among them, something dangerous had already begun. The Coruscant Peddlers Association, once humble, now waved its banners high above the city's fortified stone walls. It began as an association of struggling small merchants, bound by survival and a desire for prosperity, but over time it grew powerful, now recognized as a dominant economic force throughout all of Coruscant. Unknown to most, it secretly operated under the Herald clan's shadow, its merchants all disguised Aragsan descendants. Azadine sighed, watching busy streets. "It'd be nice if we could lay low today," he muttered cautiously. A merchant sneered, stepping closer. "Who's this?" he asked loudly, drawing curious eyes from nearby crowds. Another merchant chuckled mockingly. "Isn't this the renowned 108th Spirit, Sir Azadine?" Quite the humble disguise. Azadine remained silent, his sharp gaze unwavering. The mockery didn't faze him. Their words meant nothing. The merchant continued laughing. "Already have servants after only 3 months? Talented fellow, aren't you?" he teased. Azadine calmly responded, "These children are not my servants." His voice was firm, cutting through their arrogance. One merchant grinned. Of course. If you're asking, we absolutely have to comply." Mocking further, he added, "Exchange for this rich man's will. Got any Blue River arrowheads available?" Leaning closer, the merchant sneered. "Aren't you that weakling who became herald through special recommendations despite failing training?" Another voice laughed. "Must have stolen wealth somewhere. What a herald. Need clothes too? Borrow some rags." Azadine clenched his fists. "This is pretty bad." Nearby, Ariel calmly handed over a clean change of clothes. Azadine calmly took the offered clothes. His voice remained even. "Don't force me to embarrass you." He exhaled slowly. "Could you cut the childish pranks? I don't exactly want to beat you." One thug laughed. "Ha! You think we're acting like servants because you're oh so great?" His friends jeered. Another stepped forward. "You'd never become a herald without luck. Fight me properly if you're feeling bold." A challenger smirked. "Or are you scared of the duel's risks?" His stance made clear, challenge issued. Ariel stepped forward confidently. "You sure feel good running your mouths off," she said, smiling without fear. Azadine sighed. "The day's barely started." "That sounds like something someone like you would say." The thug scoffed. He couldn't take a single punch. "You're blind, little miss," he mocked arrogantly. Ariel's expression didn't change. "Ah, is that so?" She raised her arm and magic erupted instantly without warning. A searing strike slammed down. One thug was thrown back violently, eyes wide with shock as others screamed. "Wait, what are you doing, little miss?" the thug stammered, eyes wide as Ariel stepped closer calmly. She sneered. "Little miss, do you not understand what kind of situation you're currently trapped in?" Sword pressed against his throat, she whispered, "Prove yourself. Stop whining and demonstrate your so-called superiority now." The thug gulped nervously. "No, we didn't mean." His bravado quickly dissolved under mounting pressure. Nearby thugs instinctively stepped back, feet shuffling uneasily. The fight they expected wasn't unfolding as they'd imagined. Azzedine flinched, sensing an unexpected presence. Someone familiar had just arrived, disrupting the tense atmosphere immediately. Ariel reacted swiftly, disarming the thug without hesitation. Her movements were sharp, practiced, and left no openings. Clapping lightly, the newcomer spoke. Now, it seems things have gotten a little too heated here." Azzedine narrowed his eyes. "Long time no see, Azzedine," the man said, wearing an unreadable expression. "Right," Azzedine replied flatly. His mind raced, already calculating possible outcomes from this unwanted reunion. The man smiled politely. "Your name?" he asked. Ariel answered coldly, medium of ether, standing her ground. "I'm Derek of Sion," he continued smoothly. "I'll apologize for my comrade's behavior. Please, let's avoid bloodshed." Ariel scoffed, clearly unimpressed. Despite his words, her sword remained drawn, unwavering before the cowardly attackers. Without hesitation, Ariel struck the ground forcefully. Tension exploded. The fight was closer to erupting than calming. One thug shouted, "I already got my blood spoiled, I'm telling you." Another sneered, "Just spit on it." Derek ordered firmly, "Pito, Kosarak, devote yourselves to the association's duty." They nodded obediently. "Yes, understood." Derek smiled faintly. "Azzedine, join me. Let's share dinner together." Azzedine frowned slightly, thinking, "Why bother?" The night sky darkened. Azzedine sighed quietly and accepted, answering simply, "Understood," before preparing himself mentally. Inside his tent, Azzedine dried his hair. "I feel refreshed after soaking in a bath again." A familiar voice called from outside, "Azzedine." His shoulders tensed immediately, recognizing that unmistakable tone without hesitation. Derek sat comfortably. "Even if it's about your birth, Ariel is still highly revered, isn't she?" he continued. "Anyone daring to insult Ariel immediately faces consequences. Her influence ensures silence among the reckless." Azzedine dried his hair slowly. "Ariel has her own way of handling things," he admitted without hesitation. Derek chuckled. "You're truly an odd person," he remarked, observing Azzedine's calmness despite such heavy circumstances. "That's why you should hurry and convince Midian. Resolve this quickly before unnecessary problems begin forming." Azzedine exhaled slowly, stepping out into the cool night air, tension lingering faintly across his shoulders. The tent lights glowed softly under the twilight sky. Tonight's conversations promised to be far from simple. A simple dinner awaited, despite its modest appearance. Azzedine knew every bite carried hidden expectations tonight. "Huh?" Azzedine snapped back to attention, realizing he had completely missed Derek's earlier question. Derek leaned closer. "I was asking, have you heard anything about Ariel?" Azzedine stammered nervously. No, I haven't." Derek sighed loudly. "You sure talk little," he complained, swirling his wine impatiently while watching Azzedine closely. "Well, considering her abilities, she's not someone worth worrying over," Azzedine answered calmly, keeping his tone measured. Derek leaned forward. "Unbelievable. You even attacked association members earlier. What exactly are you thinking, Azzedine?" he demanded. Frustrated, Derek slammed the fruit basket down. "Start talking about your results already." His patience had clearly worn thin. Azzedine smirked faintly. "I'm doing my work properly. I'm collecting gold coins too," he answered, completely unfazed. Azzedine scoffed. "Screw that, Derek. Just look at this," he said, casually placing the wand forward. "Have you ever seen anything like this?" Azzedine asked, holding it up confidently for inspection. Derek nodded. "I have. Kurt Godwin's knights use that to search for the Book of Divine Kings." Derek leaned back. "Anyway, nice find, but bringing the actual book would have been far better for everyone involved." Azzedine smirked faintly, fingers tapping the table. "I did, though." His calm voice immediately silenced the entire room. Derek stood abruptly, shocked. "What?" His eyes locked on Azzedine, panic quickly overtaking his calm demeanor. Azzedine smirked faintly. "I guess all the other heralds came back empty-handed, huh?" he said confidently. Derek's expression turned desperate. His hand shot out, reaching toward the precious item Azzedine casually held aloft. "Azzedine, hand the copy over," Derek demanded, voice strained with urgency as his composure completely crumbled. Azzedine tilted his head playfully, completely unfazed by the pressure. His smile hinted at hidden intentions. Evening settled over the bustling camp. Azzedine's calm figure quietly slipped through unnoticed among distracted merchants. With perfect timing, he vanished between tents. His movements remained smooth despite carrying a noticeable heavy burden. "Azzedine!" Derek's furious shout echoed, startling birds and drawing attention from every corner of the camp. Ariel raised her brows, amused. Azzedine merely shrugged, already anticipating Derek's next desperate, predictable outburst. Derek panted heavily, completely out of breath. Meanwhile, Azadine nonchalantly continued enjoying his apple, calm and unaffected. Derek growled. "We'd protect the copy of the book better than someone as powerless as you." Azadine stayed composed. "Derek, don't you think protecting it would be harder for you, not me?" Azadine calmly added. "One of Margrave Kale's bastard sons approaches, bringing heretics loyal to Kurt along." Derek sneered. "Ha! Do you think we'd lose against them? I'm still a former herald." Azadine took another bite of his apple. "That's the problem," he muttered, unimpressed by Derek's arrogance. Derek crossed his arms. "That's not important. Protecting the book's copy is what really matters now," he pointed dismissively. "Plus, you're much weaker than Ariel. You should understand your place, Azadine." Azadine sighed. "You're referring to when we were all kids. Things were very different back then. Back then, Ariel dominated every challenge effortlessly. She stood alone, unmatched even by older, more experienced heralds. By 13, Ariel had already surpassed warriors twice her age. Her terrifying potential was undeniable to everyone." Azadine stood abruptly, brushing past Derek. "I'll just leave first," he said without waiting for permission. Derek slammed the table. "That'd be for the best," he shouted, his pride clearly wounded beyond repair. "You arrogant little— I'm your senior, you know," Derek yelled, frustration boiling over despite Azadine's indifference. A scout burst in, panicked. "Sir, we have a problem. The Eastern Gate, something's happening over there." Earlier that evening, tension built quietly. At the eastern post-town gates, unexpected trouble was already unfolding. The guard noticed movement. His eyes narrowed, quickly realizing unfamiliar travelers approached under cover of dusk. "Are they armed?" another guard asked warily, watching the group approach confidently without attempting to conceal themselves. "Wait! Too many of you to pass tonight. Camp somewhere else and return tomorrow," the guard commanded. One mercenary chuckled. "Haha, good work, Sir Gerund," he said, clearly amused by the overly formal exchange. Smiling slyly, the mercenary offered a heavy pouch. "Take this as gratitude for your hard work, sir." The guard hesitated, worry flashing across his eyes. He understood clearly things might spiral beyond their control. "If something goes wrong, we'll both end up priests in the king's church. We're in together." The mercenary smirked. "Well, if you say so." He raised his hand casually, pretending agreement. Without warning, a blade flashed. Blood splattered instantly. The guard never finished his sentence before collapsing lifelessly. Panic erupted. Soldiers scrambled backward as the mercenary seized full control, eyes cold and expressions ruthless. Shock consumed the guard's face before his body hit the ground, blood spilling across the stone floor. Another mercenary stepped forward, ruthlessly striking down soldiers without hesitation. His grin widened with every fallen opponent. "Hey, I didn't want him dead," the young master complained, clearly unsettled by the brutal scene. The mercenary laughed. "You should be happy, young master. Raids are boring without blood to entertain us." "You're overcomplicating things," the leader muttered. "There's the gate. Open it and forget everything else." He grinned darkly. The mercenary stared in horror. A hole suddenly formed in his palm, dark energy swirling ominously outward. A cursed sigil appeared midair. Strange red mist poured out, twisting unnaturally and spreading across the battlefield. Terrified screams echoed. "Heek! Spiders!" Soldiers flailed helplessly as monstrous shadow spiders crawled relentlessly toward them. Panic erupted instantly. "Wah!" One mercenary slapped wildly at his chest, horrified by hundreds of venomous spiders swarming. "Help!" Desperate cries filled the air, but the shadow spiders overwhelmed them mercilessly, leaving only chaos behind. The young master gasped, clutching his chest. A strange energy swirled rapidly through his trembling body. Dark figures emerged from the mist. One stepped forward confidently, announcing, "I'm full of power now." Sweat dripped down the young master's face. You're a curt heretic," he whispered in growing horror. The heretic smirked. "Took you long enough to notice," he replied, enjoying every second of the fear. "Let's work together, young master. You'll get revenge. I'll secure the Book of the Divine King." The heretic grinned wickedly. "Well," he muttered under his breath, fully enjoying the chaos about to unfold. Blood splattered again. His eyes gleamed dangerously, the corrupted power growing stronger with every passing heartbeat. Dark mist gathered. Soldiers collapsed instantly as invisible forces suffocated them before anyone could react or resist. "Not that you have a choice now," the heretic sneered. His control over them was absolute, unstoppable. Meanwhile, unaware of the unfolding massacre, captured civilians gathered quietly under strict surveillance near the eastern gate. The heretic sneered coldly. "No one is allowed to leave this village from now on. Get the rat." Soldiers rushed forward, weapons drawn, desperately trying to intercept the lone escaping figure. Far above, the fortress walls glowed faintly under the darkening sky, ominous and silent against the horizon. A hooded figure slipped between curtains, eyes locked onto the rising threat from the eastern fortress gates. Guards nearby murmured confusedly. "Huh?" None had noticed the shadow already moving swiftly among them unseen. Frustrated villagers gathered. "Well, those guys aren't letting us leave the village," one man explained anxiously. Another demanded, "Why can't we leave?" His voice trembled slightly, sensing the growing tension among the crowd. A guard stepped forward, eyes glowing faintly. "Because we said so," he declared, his voice unnervingly calm. "You don't have the right to stop us," someone muttered defiantly, stepping slightly forward despite the threat. Ignoring the danger, one man stood firm. "Move! I'm heading out," he declared, refusing to show fear. With one brutal motion, the guard silenced the protester, blood dripping as fear gripped the crowd. "I said, no one is allowed to leave," the enforcer repeated coldly. "Yes. No one," others echoed. A loud commotion erupted suddenly. One brave soul broke free, sprinting desperately toward the open gate. Hidden among the guards, a figure muttered quietly. "But something is strange. Yes, strange," his eyes distant. Darkness filled his mind. "I'm hungry," he growled, teeth bared, lips trembling as something terrifying awakened inside. The boy's eyes widened in terror. A dark, corrupt energy flared violently, consuming his remaining control. Green flames surged from his body. With an agonizing scream, his mind shattered under the demonic influence. Breath trembling, he tried resisting, but monstrous instincts took hold. Painful memories blurred beneath the overwhelming hunger. Suddenly, a sharp arrow whistled through the air, striking with deadly precision before anyone reacted. Blood erupted violently. Shocked gasps filled the air as the possessed victim fell lifelessly before the stunned crowd. Confused and trembling, the infected man weakly muttered, "Huh?" His mind struggled against the growing corruption. Before finishing his thought, his jaw stretched unnaturally, monstrous energy erupting violently from within his shattered body. A powerful strike descended instantly, sword piercing clean through, ending his suffering before further transformation could complete. The lifeless body collapsed with a heavy thud. Blood spread across the dirt, soaking into the ground. A lone swordsman stood firm amidst the chaos, his blade dripping, eyes cold and focused on survival. Tiny spider-like creatures crawled across the blood-soaked weapon, their green eyes glowing faintly with malicious intent. The mysterious warrior lowered his weapon confidently. "They're subordinates of the Spider Queen, Arthra," he declared calmly. Panic filled the air as terrified villagers scattered, desperately fleeing from the chaos surrounding the eastern gates. Azzedine stood calmly atop the stone platform, his blade resting, eyes locked on the approaching darkness. "Azzedine," Ariel called out, her voice breaking through the heavy tension blanketing the battlefield. Azzedine answered coldly, "No, this is just the beginning. Prepare yourselves for what's really coming. Go inside the tent, rest, and eat," he ordered. Ariel hesitated. "Right now?" she questioned, confused. Azzedine shouted back angrily, "Of course! Do you know how many people are starving to their deaths?" Ariel's eyes widened suddenly. A terrible presence crept near. She gasped, unable to utter a full warning. Shadow loomed ominously behind Azzedine. Ariel finally screamed, "Azzedine, behind you!" Her voice cracked with raw panic. Azzedine calmly turned his head. He muttered, showing no fear despite the monstrous threat emerging. In one smooth motion his blade flashed. The creature fell before it could land a single blow. Azzedine remained focused. Despite the chaos, his mind calmly analyzed the battlefield for the next threat. The corrupted victim stumbled forward, eyes glowing faintly, their thoughts consumed by a single overpowering command, "Eat, hungry." The monstrous chant grew louder, "Have meat, must eat meat," as their twisted bodies lurched toward the living. Azzedine's eyes narrowed. He's still moving despite his state. The spiders must be controlling his nervous system. Another wave advanced wildly. Without hesitation, Azzedine sprang forward, blade drawn, determined to stop the mindless horde. Azzedine smirked. "What will happen if I send shocks through his body, I wonder?" he muttered. With perfect timing, Azzedine launched forward, his weapon crackling as he aimed directly for the creature's core, the infected being convulsed violently, its unstable form unable to handle the intense electrical surges flooding its system. Ariel observed quietly. "Let's test it, shall we?" she whispered, preparing her own magic for the next wave. A brilliant surge of blue light exploded. Azzedine struck again, lightning dancing fiercely with each calculated movement. A violent pulse of dark energy burst forth. The towering creature roared, shaking the entire battlefield. With terrifying speed, the creature launched a deadly tendril upward, shattering the fortress walls effortlessly upon impact. Massive claws slammed into the ground, tearing apart stone and flesh alike, hunger driving its wild rampage. The monstrous appendage descended rapidly toward Azzedine. Calmly he pivoted, dodging it with perfect practiced precision. Azzedine countered immediately. His sword slashed through the monstrous limb, severing it before the beast could react. The corrupted horde lunged, but Azzedine's precise strikes pierced their hearts before they could even touch him. Watching the chaos calmly, Azzedine smirked slightly. "He evolved," he muttered, recognizing the creature's terrifying transformation instantly. "Azzedine," Ariel's voice rang out again, this time filled with desperation and rising fear for his safety. Azzedine remained unfazed. Gripping his burning weapon tighter, he prepared to unleash its full devastating potential. With a blazing arc, Azzedine's sword swept through the air, fire trailing, incinerating everything standing before him. The burning wave swept through the enemy ranks. They screamed, their corrupted minds unable to endure the flames. Azadin stepped forward, gripping a flaming torch. His precise control ensured the inferno didn't spread recklessly. The battlefield glowed bright orange as flames devoured the advancing horde, pushing them back from the gates. Painful, mindless wails echoed as the burning creatures stumbled, consumed entirely by the merciless firestorm. Azadin smirked. Nice work. Make sure the fire doesn't reach the merchant tents. This is half bad. The villagers gathered their courage. Burn those bastards, one shouted, rallying the others to push back fiercely. Flames devoured the corrupted horde. Their agonizing cries echoed as their bodies collapsed under the relentless firestorm. Azadin calmly approached the struggling creature. You should stay still, he muttered, flames swirling around him. With a precise motion, he ignited a blazing arc. Stay nice and toasty, Azadin said coldly. The creature screamed its final fiery cry. Flesh melted away, leaving nothing but ash and smoldering bone. Azadin stood silently among the flames, his eyes scanning the battlefield for any remaining threats nearby. Excited shouts echoed. Oh ho, it's dead! Burn the others too! The villagers had tasted victory and wanted more. Azadin sighed quietly. What about the food and water? He asked, turning toward his exhausted companions. Ariel smiled proudly. We got everything we could find. Should we bring the goats over too? Azadin laughed softly. Hold on. Weren't we really useful just now? Ariel grinned, her spirit fully restored. Ariel grinned boldly. You'll continue needing us, so you should just take us in as she began. Azadin paused. His owl familiar returned swiftly, wings stretched wide. Azadin, it called urgently from overhead. Azadin's gaze sharpened. Is there a new contractor? He asked quietly. The owl responded. West. They've just stopped breathing. Damn it, Azadin muttered under his breath. He clenched his fists, knowing the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Without hesitation, he ordered, You two, prepare the fire. We're going to the western gates. Immediately. Azadin dashed toward the western gates. His swift movements barely left a shadow beneath the evening sky. Watching from afar, Ariel sighed. He's just flat out operating us around at this point, she muttered. Without hesitation, Azadin unleashed a powerful sweeping strike, his blade glowing bright as corrupted enemies closed in. A horrid shriek rang out. The corrupted creatures stumbled backward, their bodies sliced apart by Azadin's precision. Azadin followed through seamlessly, his blade cutting a deadly arc, never stopping as more enemies fell before him. Azadin narrowed his eyes. A human would have been knocked out long ago, he muttered under his breath. Blades clashed fiercely. Azadin dodged relentless attacks, realizing these creatures mutated faster than anything he'd ever encountered before. Green-eyed horrors advanced. Not to mention, these guys just keep mutating. And their numbers are increasing rapidly, Azadin assessed. Azadin gritted his teeth. I won't even be able to reach where the contractor is at this rate. Without hesitation, he hurled his charged weapon. Lightning surged violently through the air toward its next target. Lightning surged from Azadin's spear, crackling wildly as the energy engulfed the monstrous creature completely, immobilizing it instantly. The creature collapsed violently, sending shockwaves across the battlefield. Azadin's silhouette stood firm amidst the blinding electric storm. Ariel cheered loudly, her excitement overflowing. I knew it. Lightning would be effective considering their fire weaknesses, she declared. Azadin heard someone cry out, Midiam! Concern rushed through the ranks as everyone's attention shifted toward the injured. Azadin remained quiet, his eyes narrowing slightly. He turned toward the horizon, sensing something far more dangerous approaching. Azadin calmly admitted, Midiam, you're skilled, truly an ether. His words brought hope to her determined heart. Before she could celebrate, Azadin continued, But don't push nature's gift. Go rest before it consumes you. Watching quietly, someone thought, Midiam is pushing herself this hard, just to be accepted by him. A soldier questioned Azadin, wasn't the contractor already dead? Azadin nodded, his expression unreadable against the glowing fire. Then why are you doing all this? The soldier asked, confused by Azadin's relentless determination. Azadin stood over the smoldering corpse, thinking grimly, I can't leave without checking for their origin. He turned toward Midiam. Burning them endlessly won't solve this. There's always a limit to fire. Midiam lowered her weapon, agreeing softly, You're right. Her gaze followed Azadin as he confidently stepped forward. Azadin's eyes darkened with resolve. That's why I intend on killing their leader instead. This ends tonight. Flames consumed the western gate as terrified screams echoed. Civilians fled, while the fortress collapsed behind them. A lone man turned, shielding a child behind him, face stricken with panic as shadows loomed closer. He was tackled to the ground, limbs thrashing wildly, but the beast's fangs were already sinking in. Bones cracked under pressure. A soldier watched silently, arms crossed, as gore splattered across broken cobblestones. Are you sure this is all right? The blond man asked, uneased by his companion's calm. Lars watched calmly as broken limbs cracked nearby, while Elric nervously questioned the plan's actual intent. The crunching noise worsened. Echoing through the street, a faint groan came from deeper in the alley. A bystander with silver hair winced, barely able to watch. Overwhelmed by the chaos and blood around him, Elric forced a grin, replying that the outcome differed from expectations, but progress was still being made. The silver-haired man yelled, warning the chaos would scare off the thief instead of flushing him out. A savage beast mauled its victim, tearing flesh with brutal force while firelight flickered across blood-stained ground. Bones snapped under crushing jaws, the ground stained deep red, a strange symbol beginning to form beneath. Suddenly, Lars struck the creature down with a swift blow, forcing silence upon the chaos it caused. Elric stared at the mark, voice tight with confusion, demanding to know what it meant. Lars replied grimly it was the summoning mark used to call forth the demon of the gold coin. Lars stepped forward, stating calmly that someone had summoned the demon using the forbidden summoning sigil. Kneeling beside the body, he muttered that others must be after the compendium as well. With a grim smile, he suggested the thief might not be random but sent with purpose. Elric asked cautiously if Lars planned to confront them, sensing a dangerous intent behind his calm tone. Lars chuckled, stating that fate favored him. If they summoned a messenger, it would come to him willingly. A sudden flash erupted in front of Elric, a glowing object shot straight toward his chest. Lars raised his arm and caught the projectile midair without flinching, eyes locked on the origin. Dark energy snapped from the weapon's surface as Lars gripped it tighter, sensing a familiar presence. He turned without hesitation, body already moving toward the new threat hidden just beyond the torchlight. His expression changed, focused and eerily calm, as violet energy pulsed through his fingers, weapon firmly in hand. Dark tendrils burst from Lars's head, piercing the sky as cursed energy surged violently through him. He laughed coldly, declaring the thief must answer whether he was messenger, betrayer, or something worse. The energy snapped outward. A monstrous transformation began as the body contorted and limbs split unnaturally. Now fully changed, Lars grinned, wide eyes glowing. Body monstrous, unshaken, even with a blade drawn at his throat. A shadowed figure dashed toward him from behind, blade ready, speed unmatched even in the burning chaos. The attacker's blade slashed across Lars's back, sparks flying as the demon host stumbled but didn't fall. Blood dripped from his face, but Lars smirked, eyes fixed on the one who'd landed the hit. The masked fighter scoffed, calling Lars a heretic, his tone steady, his blade still drawn without hesitation. Steel clashed with energy, the two forces collided with power, as the next duel exploded into motion. Blades locked again, Lars' claws met the sword, neither yielding, as smoke and fire churned around them. Elric deflected another attack, maintaining distance as Lars advanced, his expression cold and utterly focused. He muttered a warning. Lars's energy was shifting, pressure rising, and the battlefield growing unnaturally still. Lars roared, grabbing the swordsman mid-step, yelling that brute force would never pierce the truth he guarded. Their blades rang repeatedly, each clash louder than the last as the masked warrior watched for an opening. Without warning, a blue strike sliced through the air, aiming directly at Lars's exposed side. Lars staggered back, coughing blood as the attack pierced through his side, barely holding himself upright. A calm voice observed the scene, noting that Lars was still standing despite such a severe wound. The speaker warned Lars should have stayed down. Resisting after turning into a heretic was foolish without true strength. Facing him, Lars grinned darkly, declaring that if this was their limit, they couldn't hope to win. With a violent surge, his body twisted and grew flesh bubbling as new limbs burst forth in defiance. The masked archer stepped forward calmly, speaking with certainty as he prepared to end the creature's rampage. Lars's glowing eyes widened slightly in surprise. He hadn't expected the archer to approach so confidently. The archer called him a spider, mocking Lars's transformation as weak despite all the limbs and power. In a blink, he moved in close, grabbing Lars by surprise, lifting him with brute force. Lars screamed, retaliating wildly as a sharp jab pierced his side and the archer slipped beneath his guard. The archer invoked an ancient technique, channeling energy through his body as his blade glowed violet. He called it the Psalm of the Emperor's Reign, a forbidden strike known only to few. Mocking Lars's transformation, he remarked even monstrous limbs couldn't help those who couldn't defend their own backs. With a single word, mistletoe, he struck, the blade slicing deep into the target without hesitation. Blood erupted from Lars's chest. The slash had landed true, forcing his body to twist in pain. Azadin collapsed to the ground beside Lars's body, still breathing heavily, but his hand moved quickly. He looked up and panicked, shouting for the swordsman to stop before doing anything reckless or final. Azadin begged for a pause, claiming the man couldn't kill him. He was just a messenger, nothing more. Frantic, he rummaged through his satchel, insisting he had proof that could change the entire situation. With trembling hands, he held up a heavy pouch, shouting that it contained the Emperor's gold. Azadin, breathless, clutched the coin and shouted his wish with desperate certainty, hoping it would work. The masked warrior stared in silence, while Azadin trembled and muttered in awe, "My body." It responded. Grinning wildly, Azadin recalled the promise. The Emperor's gold could control the messenger clan's power directly. The archer warned him coldly, gold alone meant nothing unless paired with a proper and true request. Azadin tossed the coin into the sigil, and it ignited golden light pulsing from within the triangle. Azadin screamed, declaring his intent boldly. He wished to become the official seeker of the gold. A glowing voice responded from above, wings unfurling as it accepted his request to become a seeker. The archer looked unimpressed, questioning how someone like Azadine could be recognized as anything more than trash. Azadine's relief was instant, breaking into tears and cheers. Convinced he'd now been spared from certain death. From behind, another voice called his name sternly, signaling that his trial was far from over. The archer reflected silently, realizing Azadine's impulsive wish had triggered something far more dangerous than anticipated. Night fell over the region, but magical tension still lingered, evidence that the summoning wasn't fully over. Among allies, the truth emerged. Azadine's request had activated the ritual, legitimizing him as a bound seeker. They now faced a new challenge, limiting the side effects of his uncontrolled bond with the gold. Midian prepared a containment spell, considering a low-impact shock to test Azadine's current magical resistance threshold. Midian approached the archer, offering help despite his clan's distance, and the uncertain contract Azadine triggered. She questioned the fairness of aiding him without a formal bond, hinting frustration over unclear roles and obligations. Despite her complaints, she agreed to assist, annoyed but unwilling to ignore the situation's growing danger. The archer relented, officially accepting her as his apprentice. Acknowledging her skills could be useful after all. Overjoyed, Midian thanked him sincerely, promising to do her best now that the bond was acknowledged. Midian smiled while explaining her reasons, leaving the boy beside her stunned and unsure how to respond. In a flashback, he remembered threatening to jump just to get her attention, but she ignored him. He clenched his fist in frustration, realizing Midian's praise had never once been directed at his efforts. Now, Azadine was receiving her approval, and the boy silently questioned how it had even happened. Meanwhile, Midian cheerfully offered snacks and encouragement to Azadine, who stood there awkwardly but visibly motivated. Azadine panicked, fearing death as magical sparks surged around him, unsure if Midian took the request seriously. Midian unleashed her lightning spell with cheerful precision, channeling power directly at Azadine without holding anything back. Electricity engulfed Azadine's body, his skeleton briefly visible, while his scream echoed across the training field under night skies. Azadine's blade landed with precision. The enemy collapsed backward, armor clattering neutralized before launching a second strike. Beside him, his injured ally stumbled. Her stance weakened, body trembling from exhaustion after the intense skirmish. The fallen enemy remained motionless. Blood pooled beneath the mask, no sign of movement or magical retaliation followed. Azadine scanned the surroundings. With enemies down, he sheathed his weapon, eyes tracking unseen threats nearby. His focus sharpened. Something wasn't right. A hidden force lingered, waiting, watching their moment of weakness. Azadine approached the group cautiously. The atmosphere grew tense as the girl analyzed his expression in silence. Tension escalated when one member questioned his intentions. Another mocked, dismissing the moment with careless amusement. Disagreement flared. Ishmael, impatient and sharp-tongued, suggested killing Azadine now that their shared mission was complete. The others recoiled at Ishmael's words. One member objected, reminding him they had fulfilled their obligation. Azadine responded firmly, no. His tone cut through the air. He still had unfinished business with them. A divine decree was issued. The Emperor's voice officially accepted Azadine as a protected contractor. That status granted him lasting protection, even beyond his request. Due to his earned worth and sincerity, Azadine, hesitant to leave, revealed a personal goal: he wanted remaining spider mercenaries eliminated from the village. He held back the request, fearing backlash. The young contractor's persistence often led to emotional overreactions. Before they could respond, an urgent shout echoed nearby. Soldiers recognized their presence. It was the king's church. Villagers cheered, relieved by the church's arrival. Azadine watched silently, unsure of their true intentions. He decided to leave with the group. The church would handle the spider mercenary remnants. Suddenly, Ishmael called out. Panicked, he begged to join them, fearing what the church might uncover. Confused, Azadine listened as Ishmael pleaded. The man clearly hid something the church wouldn't overlook. Azadine hesitated. Ishmael reminded him of the contract's terms. Protection continued even after the task's completion. After everything, Azadine exhaled deeply. The chaos faded, but tension still lingered behind his expression. Later, Ishmael frantically searched for shelter. He shouted at passersby, trying to command their attention. Locals froze in place. A knight's sudden presence caused fear, especially from someone dressed like Ishmael. Ishmael's arrogance flared. His companions quickly restrained him, trying to avoid attracting more attention to themselves. A masked figure answered calmly. She explained they were travelers and needed only a night's lodging. A local villager welcomed the group without hesitation, offering shelter and directing them toward a safe place. The masked traveler nodded in thanks. The man explained his family had early chores and needed rest. Ishmael whispered complaints. He was stopped before lashing out, his prejudice showing through condescending remarks about commoners. Azadine asked for clarification. Ishmael arrogantly claimed poor people remained poor because they lacked discipline and effort. Azadine stiffened at the harsh judgment. Tension quietly rose as his patience with Ishmael began to thin. Azadine smirked and reminded Ishmael that even nobles had reasons for traveling with common mercenaries. Ishmael's pride flared, but the truth stung. He couldn't argue against his own suspicious circumstances. The masked companion dismissed the moment, advising Ishmael to think more before speaking again so carelessly. The group settled their plan. Animals tied downstairs, and everyone would rest on the upper floor. Ishmael hesitated again, grimacing. He questioned the cleanliness of their shelter, clearly unaccustomed to rough conditions. As they settled down, the girl turned to Azadine with a quiet, serious question about authority. She asked directly what the king's church was like, curious about their reputation and true nature. Azadine recalled the villagers' reactions, fear and relief mixed, when the holy knights appeared during tense moments. He explained they enforced royal laws and practiced white magic, which made citizens trust their authority. Azadine's thoughts trailed off as Ishmael snored nearby, clearly unaffected by the conversation or their concerns. Ishmael groaned loudly in his sleep, disturbing the quiet as everyone tried settling in for rest. Azadine and the girl watched, unimpressed, but chose not to react further to the disruption. He suggested sleep. They agreed rest was necessary after the day's events and the tension with Ishmael. Morning arrived. The sun rose calmly over the nearby forest where Azadine's group remained unaware of danger. Unseen by them, armored feet stepped into the forest's edge. Someone was approaching from the shadows. A patrol unit led by Sir Gardreg advanced through the forest, scanning for signs of threat. One soldier, tired and annoyed, asked Gardreg how much longer they would wander the woods without purpose. Gardreg replied curtly, expressing his own frustration, but determined to complete the mission without shortcuts or lies. Another soldier complained loudly, suggesting they lie about completing the task and return for rest and drink. Before finishing his thought, the soldier noticed something. His tone shifted. He had spotted something unusual ahead. The knights paused near the tree line. One asked quietly about a rumor that clearly made others uncomfortable. Gardreg responded sharply, refusing to explain. The mood shifted as awkward curiosity spread among the soldiers. Another questioned if they too could be considered her juniors, confused about hierarchy within their own ranks. Before any theories could grow, Gardreg shut them down and ordered everyone to resume the search immediately. He exhaled slowly, hiding irritation behind a sigh. Their mission was already testing his patience and focus. Gardreg froze. Something primal stirred in the air, and his instincts screamed a warning before sound came. A knight called to him, unaware of the growing threat hiding behind the tree line's thick shadow. Gardreg silenced them with a raised hand, urging quiet as danger crept closer through the underbrush. He listened carefully. A low, unnatural growl rumbled. The trees trembled. Whatever approached wasn't ordinary or small. From the darkness emerged a towering wyvern, muscular, winged and furious. The knights were no longer alone. Gardreg pushed through the bushes, urgency rising. A knight beside him panicked, preparing to fire. The wyvern's eye gleamed red in the shadows. It had already spotted the intruders approaching. Without waiting for orders, the knights readied their bows. One shouted, demanding someone shoot immediately. Gardreg yelled to stop them. His instincts screamed this wasn't the right time to provoke it. Too late, an arrow flew from a drawn bow, slicing through air straight toward the creature. The wyvern leapt forward, dodging the incoming arrow. Its wings spread wide, charging toward the knights. Panic erupted. One of the knights screamed, realizing too late that the creature was already too close. The beast flew low, swift and furious. Its claws tore through tree limbs like paper. With a powerful flap, it unleashed a shockwave. The ground shook as dust and force exploded outward. The knights stared upward in shock. The wyvern soared above them, circling with unmatched speed and strength. The knights regrouped. One complained aloud, frustrated by the failed encounter and the creature's sudden escape. Gardreg calmly analyzed the situation. The wyvern was young, which meant stronger adults could be nearby. A soldier called out to Gardreg, nervous. The sudden tension in his voice caught immediate attention. He pointed toward a trampled path. Fences were crushed. It looked like a farm had recently stood there. Gardreg's eyes narrowed. He understood the implications. Something dangerous had already been here before they even arrived. A wounded villager held his wife near the damaged fence, unaware of the soldiers drawing closer. A cloaked man cursed under his breath, clearly distressed as he faced the aftermath of destruction. Voices whispered dark orders. Someone claimed the villagers were responsible and needed to be killed immediately. The man justified it quickly. Blame had been shifted, and they must act to protect themselves. Marching toward the scene, knights obeyed without question. Avoiding punishment now mattered more than the truth. The injured couple held each other tightly, trembling as footsteps approached, casting long shadows over them. Their eyes widened in horror as masked knights raised weapons, intent on erasing all witnesses. With deadened resolve, one of the knights declared their intent: no survivors, no questions, just orders followed. Screams echoed across the trees as morning light broke. Blood spilled before reason could interrupt duty. Elsewhere, Azadine stirred awake. A voice demanded he rise. Something urgent was about to begin again. Azadine opened his eyes slowly, tension in his jaw. The weight of responsibility had returned again. He sat up quietly, determination returning. Whatever awaited outside, the 108th spirit would face it without hesitation. Azadine steadied himself upright. Though tired, he acknowledged the call. His duty had summoned him again. He frowned slightly. It hadn't even been 2 hours since he had fallen asleep on straw. A voice echoed in his mind, stating that only those who respond to duty are worthy. Azadine reflected silently. That standard was rare. Most would ignore the call when no one else was watching. Suddenly, a voice shouted from outside. Azadine's eyes snapped toward the window, alert to new trouble. A boy rushed into the building, footsteps frantic. His panic stirred Azzedine and broke the morning silence. Azzedine turned sharply. The boy grabbed his sleeve, voice trembling as fear overwhelmed his young face. He stammered desperately, barely holding back tears. His father had been killed by knights, not monsters. The words hit hard. The knights had murdered innocents, not outlaws. Azzedine's expression hardened instantly. Outside, the reality lay bare. Villagers were slaughtered, their blood soaking the earth beneath the rising sun. A sword struck down with brutal force. Blood sprayed across the ground, ending another villager's desperate escape. The knight wiped his blade, unfazed by the kill. Around him, corpses marked their merciless path. Another knight approached and asked if the boy had been located during the sweep of survivors. His partner responded firmly, no sign of the child. He had vanished without leaving a trace. Gardreg stared into the distance, eyes sharp. Silence lingered as he calculated what to do next. Blood pooled beside a lifeless body. The narrator reflected on darkness, crime, and the fate of survivors. He remembered friends who once laughed freely, now dead, punished as examples or killed by the system. Execution was seen as necessary. They called it balance, a way to reset lives of guilt. He recalled being bound in chains, watching others vanish into death while he awaited a sentence himself. Most who escaped justice didn't live long. The streets consumed them, or they became something worse. The old man, weary and worn, lay in silence. Death now would disrupt the final goodbye. He remembered Maya's son mocked and mistreated for his origin, but he endured with stubborn resilience. Gardreg stood quietly, deep in thought. Despite everything, this mission had become personal beyond orders. To him, it wasn't duty, it was fatherhood. He would do anything to protect that bond. Driven by resolve, Gardreg barked new orders. More targets remained, none would be spared this time. A knight scanned the field, eyes narrowed. His armor bore blood, but his stance stayed alert. He shouted, spotting movement. A figure dashed through the trees. Someone was trying to escape the slaughter. Another knight mocked the attempt. Confident, he raised his spear and prepared to end the escape. With a violent thrust, the spear launched through the air, spiraling toward the distant fleeing target. It struck the runner's leg. Blood followed as the body collapsed. Momentum shattered mid-sprint. The woman fell hard, face hitting the ground. Pain shot through her body as she screamed. One knight mocked her injury, pretending the spear wound was accidental, blaming slippery hands stained with blood. The knights approached without hesitation, circling her. Escape was impossible. She was surrounded on open ground. Suddenly, something struck a knight's helmet, shattering it on impact. The force came from the nearby woods. Eyes wide with shock, the soldier turned. Whatever had attacked wasn't just trying to scare them. The wounded woman turned suddenly, eyes widening. A wave of energy tore through the ground beside her. One knight panicked. Tarsik had fallen in seconds. The others struggled to understand what just happened. A blinding arc of energy struck again. The impact shattered shields and launched soldiers into the air. Gardreg gritted his teeth, shouting for answers. Whoever attacked had power beyond anything they had anticipated. He drew his sword, preparing for confrontation. Heavy footsteps echoed. Someone was closing in with intent. Azzedine walked forward calmly. His voice cut through the tension. He blamed the knights for disturbing his rest. Without hesitation, he charged. The knights reacted too late as Azzedine closed the distance in seconds. They swung their spears in defense, but Azzedine leapt through the arcs, avoiding every calculated strike. He noted the disadvantage. With no weapon in hand, direct combat was too risky against spears. He dove low and seized a fallen weapon. Removing their reach would shift control of the fight. Azzedine launched forward with explosive force, sending shockwaves beneath him. The knights struggled to track his movement. One soldier shouted in disbelief, refusing to believe Azzedine could overpower them without noble rank or reinforcement. Azzedine whispered a phrase, "Yellow Crane," as energy surged into his limbs, tightening his control over the momentum. With precise movement, Azzedine flipped over the knights, evading their reach while channeling power into his next strike. Landing with calculated poise, Azzedine repositioned silently. The knights turned too slowly. His next attack was already prepared. Azzedine landed with force, creating a shock wave. Dust and wind blasted outward as he stabilized himself. He launched forward again, delivering a clean blow to the next knight, breaking his stance immediately. Fist clenched, Azzedine continued his approach. His precision and timing left no room for counterattacks or escape. One knight stared in disbelief. Azzedine stood calmly amid the chaos, unaffected and fully in control. Terror surged through another soldier. He screamed, overwhelmed by the sudden realization of how outmatched they were. One knight shouted in disbelief. He couldn't understand why Azzedine dared to interfere with their holy duty. Gardreg stepped forward, announcing their authority. They were knights of the king's church, undeniable in status and command, Azzedine replied calmly, questioning the title. He saw no honor in what they were doing here. Gardreg called the villagers heathens, justifying their slaughter with religious doctrine and assumed divine righteousness. Azzedine stood firm and demanded evidence. His voice echoed, "Truth must be proven, not claimed without question." Azzedine questioned their judgment. How could simple farmers working at dawn be labeled as heathens? Gardreg dismissed the logic. Only the holy knights, he claimed, had the right to declare heresy. He narrowed his eyes at Azzedine. suggesting that questioning them was itself a sign of heresy. Drawing his weapon slowly, Gardrig accused Azadine directly. Resistance meant guilt. Defiance marked him as an enemy. With blade drawn and glowing, Gardrig stood firm. The next moment would decide everything. Gardrig raised his glowing blade, unleashing a radiant burst of light that engulfed the battlefield instantly. Azadine stood calmly. His eyes widened slightly as the blinding light raced outward in all directions. A bystander shouted desperately, warning others to shut their eyes before the technique's full flash triggered blindness. Azadine remembered the pattern. It was identical to an earlier attacker light, then a sudden violent strike. The light overwhelmed several nearby. They cried out, shielding their eyes, unable to see what came next. Gardrig unleashed a devastating pillar of light, aiming to end Azadine with overwhelming holy force. Shouting "Die!" Gardrig charged within the beam's glow, confident that his strike would land unopposed. Azadine's eyes narrowed. He detected the movement clearly, waiting for the exact moment to respond. With fluid motion, Azadine redirected the strike, deflecting Gardrig's sword before it could reach his body. Onlookers watched in shock. The unstoppable knight had been blocked. Azadine stood firm, still holding the line. The girl stepped forward defiantly while her ally aimed steady, both ready to defend Azadine together. Azadine leapt from the hill, blade drawn, reacting to a sudden presence none of them sensed nearby. Ro froze as Azadine landed. No enemies in sight, just tension, as if danger had passed unseen. The group closed in cautiously, uncertain if Azadine attacked a threat or hallucinated another phantom from the curse. Azadine's silence revealed doubt. His instincts flared without cause, a symptom growing worse with each passing encounter. They recalled earlier ambushes by holy knights. Now, paranoia spread. Was Azadine losing control, or sensing something deeper? A lone soldier approached, sword raised. His presence shifted the air. Azadine's group immediately prepared for confrontation. Ro recognized the man's insignia. His expression darkened, realizing trouble had followed them out of the forest. The soldier pointed accusingly, shouting. He had identified the members of the outlawed Herald clan, cursed and hunted. Whispers spread. Nearby villagers reacted in fear, realizing the Emperor's enemies had quietly entered their peaceful home. The man declared them soulless heathens. His voice echoed with hatred, confirming the villagers' fate was sealed. Azadine questioned the soldier's claim, calmly suggesting the accusation lacked evidence beyond his own biased assumption. The soldier hesitated, momentarily thrown off by Azadine's composure and the logic behind his indirect challenge. Analyzing their weapons, Azadine deduced they were hunters, not invaders. Short spears weren't suited for real combat. He proposed they had accidentally killed a local, then silenced witnesses to cover their careless mistake. The soldier exploded in anger, shouting over the accusation, unable to refute it without exposing the truth. Azadine stood calmly, eyes locked on the soldier, aware that provocation was no longer avoidable now. The soldier grinned, raising his blade. He mocked Azadine, recognizing him as a valuable, high-ranking herald. Without warning, divine energy surged. Runes ignited beneath the soldier's feet as a glowing spear formed above. He declared victory certain. Capturing Azadine would justify everything. The radiant weapon descended with terrifying force and speed. Azadine reacted instantly. As the enemy launched the spell, he commanded, "Get ready," with firm resolve. The soldier focused, channeling divine energy into the artifact. His eyes reflected certainty in divine punishment. The holy symbol expanded mid-air. Its magical presence thickened as he positioned himself for a decisive strike. Azadine observed the construct forming above. He tightened his grip, calculating the spell's origin and weak point. With swift movement, Azadine hurled his blade. It sliced through the air toward the glowing magical construct. The sword struck cleanly. A sharp flash exploded as the divine cube cracked violently under the impact. The holy construct cracked further. Azadine's attack wasn't enough. The magic core remained intact, still pulsing power. Azadine muttered in frustration, realizing the containment spell hadn't failed. A stronger blow was now necessary. The box released a shockwave. He shielded the others, but both he and Ariel were thrown back. Azadine turned calmly, stepping past the chaos. He approached Ariel without hesitation, eyes already scanning her gear. Ariel noticed his intent. Before he asked, she handed over her enchanted blade without hesitation or question. The glowing cube resisted destruction. Runes flared again, unleashing another violent shockwave across the scorched forest floor. Azadine braced himself mid-charge. The ground cracked beneath him, the sheer pressure forcing him to reconsider timing. He spotted its movement, unstable but pulsing. The artifact was weakening, but still capable of dangerous retaliation. Without hesitation, he knocked 3 arrows, breathing steady. His aim narrowed, seeking a precise, decisive impact point. The arrows flew at once. Each one targeted a different rune carved into the floating golden cube. Ariel shouted in panic. His arrows missed their mark, and the artifact's energy began rising dangerously. The enemy mocked them, laughing at the failed shot. He underestimated the group's resolve and coordination completely. He readied his next move. He remained calm, knowing this was only the opening in their setup. Suddenly, Ro dashed forward. With one quick motion, he struck the distracted soldier before he could respond. Using the momentum, Ro launched himself into the air, aiming to land a direct strike on the cube. The ground split from impact. Dust rose quickly, but the enemy realized Ro had vanished mid-charge. Confused, he scanned the field. Ro's presence had disappeared from his line of sight entirely. Suddenly, Ro emerged above him, his blade already descending. The surprise left the soldier completely unprepared. With both hands gripping the hilt, Ro steadied himself in the air, channeling weight into the strike. The sword fell like a bolt. The enemy had no time to block as it descended fast. He remained focused, sensing something strange. His instincts told him the fight hadn't ended, something was incoming. Ariel's eyes widened. From across the field, an unfamiliar energy surged, drawing everyone's attention suddenly. A swift object sliced through the sky. The noise cut sharply, startling the group into readiness. A blue arc shot past them too fast to follow. Its origin and purpose were completely unknown. Azadine turned calmly, adjusting his stance. He understood this wasn't over. Someone else had just entered the fight. He stayed alert. Though the threat was gone, his expression remained unreadable, voice low and restrained. Time passed. The battle's dust settled. Quietness returned, though its silence felt heavier than any noise. The village roofs glowed under daylight, but peace had arrived too late for some to witness it. He reached a fallen man's side. The injuries were fatal, there was nothing left to be done. A young boy ran over. His voice broke as he screamed, "Mom! Dad!" in complete despair. A grieving woman sobbed quietly over a fallen body. Her pain echoed across the quiet village square. She covered her face, overwhelmed. The reality of loss was setting in for those left behind. He stood over the mourners. His silence showed restraint, yet his presence called for immediate justice. He faced the captured knights, asking directly, "What will you do?" His voice carried weight and control. He offered mercy only if they agreed to repay the families for the lives their actions destroyed. He offered a condition: the knights must repent and serve the people they once harmed deeply. One knight hesitated. His thoughts raced. He only wanted to survive, not truly atone for anything. Fearful, the knight agreed. "Understood," he muttered, planning silently to escape once trust had been restored. Before he could respond, a shout interrupted. A villager stormed forward, eyes filled with grief and rage. With trembling fury, the man screamed, "They killed my son!" Justice and mercy now clashed in plain view. A villager stepped forward, fury building. The people resented being called heathens after all they endured. For years, the villagers had obeyed the church, offering everything even when left starving during hard seasons. They never rebelled, yet still, they were condemned by knights who acted without reason or fairness. He intervened quickly, sensing the crowd's anger might explode. He wanted justice, not another wave of violence. One knight, still bound, shouted in protest. His pride blinded him, even as guilt clung to silence. Without warning, the woman struck. Rage and grief overtook her as the knight's insult reignited buried pain. Her blade sliced through the air. The gathered villagers gasped, stunned by her sudden, decisive violence. One knight trembled, watching his comrade fall. The situation had turned beyond negotiation. Fear replaced defiance instantly. The woman stepped forward again. Her voice was cold, steady. There was no justice left for talk. Tears in her eyes, she whispered his survival was unbearable. Her grief now demanded its own justice. The second knight was executed. Blood marked the ground. The villagers had delivered judgment without hesitation or mercy. Azadine watched silently. The village had made its choice. Those knights would never be called protectors again. He knew this act would haunt them. Their names, once clean, were now bound to vengeance. In a bloodstained room, a child wept. Around him, silence weighed heavier than screams ever could. The sun set slowly. Justice, grief, and violence now shared the land. A new chapter had begun. As the sun set, Azadine stood quietly. The burden of leadership now felt heavier than victory. He reassured the group. With the knights gone, they no longer faced direct threats from the church. But questions lingered. Doubts about justice and the legitimacy of the king's church crept into their thoughts. He turned to Azadine, asking what many wondered if forgiveness was truly ever part of the plan. Azadine stared into the fading sky. His silence spoke louder than words. Intentions weren't so simple now.